Is Mr. Kilby here? Is Kilby here yet? Is Kilby here yet? Do you know he's on the
on the floor last night.
Okay. Okay.
Commissioner Werfel, thank you for being here today. I first want to address an issue that has been widely reported last week. A whistleblower came forward with troubling claims about abuses of power. And we are conducting a review of this matter and will go wherever the facts lead us. And I expect full cooperation from the IRS, particularly with regard to ensuring this whistleblower is protected from any retaliation. We value the importance and the role of whistleblowers in ensuring the integrity of our governing institutions, which is why we established an online portal providing IRS employees a direct avenue to provide information regarding any wrongdoing that they may witness or believe to be occurring. Commissioner, while I know you are fairly new on the job, it would be irresponsible not to put you on notice about the various concerns the American people have about your agency. Over the past 2 years, the IRS has leaked private tax information of Americans at the same time the Biden administration was pushing tax increases on those very individuals. Accidentally posted online the private taxpayer information of thousands of retirees. They apologized, they took it down, said it wouldn't happen again, and did the very same thing 4 months later. They destroyed over 30 million tax returns due to the backlog. They tried and then delayed for a year a new paperwork nightmare of gig economy workers under the new 1099K reporting requirements and promised to release a spin plan for the $80 billion pay raise Democrats gave the agency, only to fail to explain whether low-income taxpayers will be protected from increased audits, and failed to show exactly how many bureaucrats in total you plan to put on the payroll. Repurpose $3.9 billion of the $80 billion to support costly green corporate handouts, and request an additional $43 billion for your agency last month on top of the $80 billion it received last August. Concocted plans to become the tax preparer, the tax filer, and government auditor of the American people. I was surprised that after receiving the greatest windfall in agency history, the president's fiscal year 24 budget requested an additional $43 billion. That's 91% of which is targeted toward enforcement and operations, like further increasing audits on middle-class families. Meanwhile, the IRS cannot tell us in total, beyond the next 2 years, how many people it plans to hire with its new funding. Statements from you and Secretary Yellen make clear that audit rates will rise for Americans earning less than $400,000. The only question left is how fast those rates will rise. When I asked for a plan, I was not looking for assurances. I was looking for concrete proposals of how the Treasury Department and your agency will protect lower and middle income Americans. I look forward to you making good on your commitment from last week to follow up with far more detail about how your agency plans to spend these funds over the next 10 years. Democrats supercharged the IRS with the hopes of raising billions to pay for special interest tax breaks for the wealthy that are now projected to cost 3 times that amount. Now the IRS is dedicating billions to support these green corporate handouts. And it's clear Democrats are all about subsidizing the low-emission lifestyles of the wealthy. It's not only new audits Americans have to worry about. The Inflation Reduction Act includes new reporting requirements for any Venmo or PayPal transaction over $600. Is it really a top priority for tax collectors to know whether someone is selling a used couch or unused concert tickets or paying for their neighbor's kid to mow the lawn? This gives your agency too much power and in effect creates a surveillance network that will invade Americans' privacy and squeeze them out of more of their hard-earned dollars. The IRS has a lot of work to do to repair the trust it has broken with the public over the last decade. I hope we can begin the conversation to do that in today's hearing. And I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Ranking Member Neal, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means Commissioner Werfel. It certainly is an honor to have you here today, and we look forward to working with you as you start your time as the Commissioner. So let's start by saluting the dedicated workers of the Internal Revenue Service. It's their commitment to taxpayers that has allowed for the Inflation Reduction Act to make such quick headway. Many members on the other side of the aisle in their constituencies are already taking advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of investments as they relate to the tax credits. Your testimony this morning or this afternoon comes at an important time for the IRS. The Democratic multi-year investment in the Internal Revenue Service has already unlocked a new era of service for America's taxpayers. This filing season alone, Americans experienced a historic level of customer assistance and support. 2 million more calls were answered through live assistance. Wait times were drastically decreased. New digital tools were introduced, and in-person services at taxpayer assistance centers were expanded. Modernizing the IRS should have been a bipartisan undertaking. Its systems needed to be remodeled, and we are appreciative of the fact that it appears as though the much-needed headway is now underway. Updates to technology infrastructure will pay dividends for the American taxpayers for decades to come. It still is the old adage, people at the bottom shouldn't be paying for more than they ordinarily would because people at the top are able to escape their fair share. The Inflation Reduction Act also reverses decades of Republican targeted cuts to the IRS, taking action to close the tax gap and eliminate our two-tiered tax system. Far too long, the wealthy and the well-connected have been able to get away with not paying their share at the expense of everyday Americans. Interesting to note that the compliance rate for those who pay taxes through withholding is in the high 90 percentiles. The IRS recently released strategic operating plans. It's a strong blueprint for bringing our historic legislation to reality. Soon the IRS will be better equipped to ensure that the top 1% of those who avoid the tax system will be held accountable. Once again, the contrast between our achievements and the extremism of the other side could not be more clear. We have pushed for decided action to regain taxpayers' trust and build a fairer tax code, and just yesterday, our colleagues on the other side doubled down on undoing this progress and thereby adding to the deficit. While we are looking out for workers and their families, they apparently were looking out for their own, costing taxpayers $100 billion. That is sadly not the limit of that extremism. They have advocated for legislation that would abolish the IRS in favor of a 30% national sales tax. I served on this committee when members on the other side did precisely that. Republicans would raise the cost of groceries, gas, medicine, child care, and just about all aspects of life for the middle class, while extending the unfunded tax cuts for the wealthy and well-connected. That would create more harm than good. So I look forward to working with you as we continue to implement the Inflation Reduction Act and deliver on our shared commitment to a tax system that works for all members of the American family. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. Today's sole witness is the very new Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, Mr. Daniel Werfel. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record today. Commissioner Werfel, you can begin when you're ready.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the filing season and the IRS budget. I'm pleased to report the IRS provided substantially better service to taxpayers during the 2023 filing season. We delivered a strong tax season for the nation, the best in several years. IRS employees were able to make substantial improvements this tax season because of funding Congress provided through the Inflation Reduction Act. This funding made a difference. It allowed us to hire more than 5,000 phone assisters, which led to a phone level of service averaging 85% during the filing season. The average wait time on the phone was 3 minutes. This is a major improvement from last year when service levels were under 16% and wait times averaged 28 minutes. Perhaps most telling was this. IRS employees answered 7 million calls to help taxpayers. That's 2.7 million more than last year. Improvements were seen in other areas. We increased face-to-face visits at our taxpayer assistance centers to 523,000, up about 30% from the year before. And we expanded digital scanning efforts to speed up the processing of paper returns. Providing a better filing season experience this year was an important step, but more work remains. The long-term funding gives us a unique opportunity to transform our agency over the next decade. Historically, the IRS received funding that allowed our staffing and operations to keep pace with the size of the U.S. population. In 2010, that changed. Cuts in annual funding caused IRS staffing levels to decline by nearly 17% to less than 80,000 full-time employees by 2022. While the IRS shrank, the U.S. population grew by more than 7%, reaching 334 million. These reductions caught up with us. You could see that in the poor taxpayer service levels in previous years, including last year. We were able to improve this filing season by shifting Inflation Reduction Act funds over to our day-to-day operations. If we continue using IRA funds this way, focused on short-term operations rather than long-term systemic improvements, we will not be able to transform the taxpayer experience, modernize outdated IRS technology, and deliver more effective enforcement of the tax laws as the IRA envisioned. The IRA funding was designed to restore IRS core operations and prepare the agency to serve the nation in its future. But that work is outside of our base funding levels. That level of funding, which is $12.3 billion for fiscal year 2023, has not materially increased since fiscal year 2010. In fact, in real terms, we are 33% below our funding level in FY 2010 if we had just received inflationary adjustments. It's not enough resources to fund a tax system in an economy that grows in size and complexity every year. So I ask for your help to build on the remarkable progress we saw this filing season by supporting the $1.8 billion in incremental discretionary funding requested for fiscal year 24. This funding will enable us to maintain our current performance in the next filing season while allowing us to use IRA resources as Congress intended to modernize our operations so we can sustain and improve our service to taxpayers into the future. Our strategic operating plan lays out in detail our path forward, describing how we will improve all aspects of our operations. The plan, which I call our public to-do list, lays out more than 200 projects for improvements for taxpayers, tax professionals, and IRS employees that will transform our work on the phones, in person, and online. IRA funding also gives us an important opportunity to improve enforcement efforts to promote fairness while respecting taxpayer rights. The agency will follow Secretary Yellen's directive not to raise audit rates above historic levels for small businesses and households making less than $400,000. I want to be crystal clear. We are not increasing audit rates for hardworking taxpayers making under $400,000. That is my pledge. There is no new surge of audits coming for workers, retirees, and others. We have plenty of other areas we need to focus on. I am optimistic we can build on the accomplishments of this filing season. The question is not whether the IRS can improve taxpayer services. This year we proved that dramatic improvement is possible. The question is whether we continue to improve. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, that concludes my statement. I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll now proceed to the question and answer session, and I will begin. Nearly 2 years since a massive leak of confidential taxpayer information was published by ProPublica, the American people are still without answers from the Biden administration on who is responsible and how this could have occurred. This leak happened at the same time the administration was pushing for higher taxes on the same taxpayers who had their information disclosed. Given this terrible breach of trust at the IRS, what has the agency done in the last 2 years to secure its systems to prevent something like this from happening again?
Mr. Chairman, data security is essential to everything we do. For the whole system to work, taxpayers have to have trust in our abilities here. And as I roll up my sleeves on the job, I'm taking numerous steps to assess our current capacities and our current gaps. And I have to tell you, there are areas that I have been impressed with. We successfully defend more than 1 billion cyber attacks a year. And I've looked into our employee training. It's very robust, including what are the consequences of failure to secure our data. But as you mentioned, there are areas we need to improve. And I would point to TIGTA and GAO have a series of recommendations for how to strengthen our overall data security process, in particular with respect to our IT. And underfunding is one major reason why we don't have the score, an A on that report card. But with funding under the IRA and with renewed purpose around data security and IT modernization, my objective is to get that A on the report card for those TIGTA recommendations and those GAO recommendations.
Let's get the A, Commissioner.
Absolutely.
As we discussed previously, we set up an online whistleblower portal for IRS personnel wishing to share information with the committee. I continue to urge you to let your employees know about the portal. I believe it will encourage agency personnel who witness wrongdoing to come forward. And just this last week, we received outreach from an IRS whistleblower requesting the committee look into concerns the individual has about allegations of misconduct. So can you commit that there will be no retaliation against that whistleblower?
Mr. Chairman, while I can't comment on a specific case, I can say without any hesitation, there will be no retaliation for anyone making an allegation or a call to a whistleblower hotline.
Thank you, Commissioner. The Biden administration first asked for $80 billion to hire 87,000 new employees. The administration later claimed it would be hiring to replace retirements, and it would not be adding 87,000 additional employees. However, the information you released related to how the agency will spend the funding shows 30,000 new employees in just the next 2 years. At that rate, you will surpass 87,000 over 10 years. Can you clear up the discrepancies here? And right now, you have 85,000 employees at the IRS. How many total employees do you intend to have working at the IRS in 10 years?
Mr. Chairman, as I told the Senate Finance Committee last week, we are working on a final set of estimates for that, and I'll have that information, the full 10-year view of the hiring plan within the next few weeks. I can clarify a couple of things, though, about your question, which is one important point is also to recognize the attrition that we have. Through 2024, 16,000 IRS employees are expected to retire. So this is not all about plussing up IRS staff. We are also making up for the staff that we're losing to retirement and other attrition. The other point I want to make about staffing increases is that staffing increases are necessary to keep pace with the tax system that we have today. You know, in my opening statement, I talked about the rise in the population, the rise in the number of filers, the rise in the complexity of the tax law. That means we get more phone calls to our call center. That means we get more people walking into our walk-in centers. And if we don't have the staff to meet them, answer their questions, then we're failing the American people in doing our job to serve them. And on the enforcement side, just one more point. Today, we have 2,600 IRS employees that are responsible for assessing the most wealthy taxpayers, the most wealthy filers. That's individuals, large corporations, and complex partnerships. There are roughly 390,000 of these wealthy taxpayers. I'm not talking about $400,000 a year. I'm talking about $10 million a year. I'm talking about $10 million in assets. I'm talking about, for these large corporations, $250 million in assets. For the very top of our income strata, 390,000 filers, 2,600 staff. And as a result, we've seen a dramatic decline in the audit coverage of our wealthiest filers. And when you see our staffing numbers over the next 10 years and you have them through the 3-year window, I ask you to think about what we're doing is closing the gap when we talk about enforcement between those 2,600 employees and the 390,000 of our wealthiest filers in America.
In regards to your comments earlier about not increasing audit rates on people making less than $400,000 a year, there's been a lot of statements from Secretary Yellen that says that the audit rates will not be above that of the historical audit rates, which was 2010 was the peak. When you say that there's not going to be an increase in audit rates, are you referring to the audit rates last year or the historical, like what Secretary Yellen has said?
Let me provide some clarity on that, Mr. Chairman. Here's where I'm at on this in consulting with Secretary Yellen and her team. We have a lot of work to do over the next few years. We're going to be focused completely on doing what I said earlier, closing the gap between our staff and the enforcement we need to do with our wealthiest. What that means is the audit rate, the most recent audit rate we have, that's complete and final, is 2018. That is the rate that I want to share with the American people. The audit rate will not go above that rate for years to come. Because for the next several years at least, we're going to be focused on the work that we're doing with the highest income filers. Now, once we start and reconsider that, because the 2008 rate is so low, it's not anywhere near the historical rate. If you probably looked at the years and said, wow, the historical rate's a lot higher than the rate in the most recent years. So even if we did start increasing our audit footprint a few years from now, then you're still not going to get anywhere near the historical average for quite some time. So I think there can be assurances to the American people that if you earn under $400,000, there's no new wave of audits coming. The probability of you being audited before the Inflation Reduction Act and after the Inflation Reduction Act are not changed at all.
The Inflation Reduction Act spends $15 million to pay for a supposedly independent analysis about the feasibility of setting up an e-file system through the IRS, which would essentially make the agency it would make the agency the American people's tax filer, their tax collector, but also their auditor. Asking the IRS to do your taxes is like asking your kid to guard the cookie jar. The temptation to take more than their so-called fair share is too much. Nevertheless, you all choose to hire an organization, New America, and a tax attorney, both of which have stated their support for establishing such an e-file system. How are we to expect this will be an impartial review if those in charge of it are already committed to seeing it happen?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. When I arrived at the IRS, I learned that we have this study that's mandated under the Inflation Reduction Act to study a direct file option. I want to stress the word option there because I think the important thing is whether we go forward with a direct file solution or not, and if we were to, it is an option for taxpayers. If they feel concerned about engaging with the IRS in a direct file solution, they don't have to do it. There are other ways to engage with the IRS. And that's, by the way, part of our hope and our vision that we will meet taxpayers where they are. If they want to file in paper, we're not thrilled with it, but we'll be ready for it. If they want a fully digital experience, if they want to work with a third-party servicer, we want to accommodate that. They currently don't have a direct file option, so my understanding from the Inflation Reduction Act is to study it and see if it's viable. The report's not done yet. It will be done by mid-May, and I understand, Mr. Chairman, that you have a keen interest in seeing what this report says. I will make myself available once the report is out to answer any questions that you have. I'm happy to come back to this committee and testify on it. I just think it would be premature to get into the details of the study before it's finalized.
You know, our committee has learned that a different organization, a MITRE, that occasionally does work for the IRS, conducted a study around taxpayer opinions about an IRS e-file system. Among their findings, Most working class Americans who file simple tax returns do not want an IRS system. And the plan is only popular in cases where the IRS could pull off handling complex tax returns and providing state returns, basically adding a tax preparation software company inside the IRS. A lack of trust in government was one of the main reasons taxpayers would oppose an IRS system. And without objection, I'll be submitting the MITRE study for the record. So ordered. Commissioner Werfel, why wasn't the IRS transparent with the American people about this study?
Well, I want to make clear, Mr. Chairman, the IRS didn't ask for this study. We didn't commission the study. Often you have companies, nonprofits, academics on their own writing white papers, writing studies that the IRS didn't ask for. But if they send it to us, then we absolutely will look at it, in particular if it's credible, and MITRE is a very credible organization. And we have received the study from MITRE, and we were under the impression that it was going to be made public so that there wasn't a need to immediately report it out. But there was no intention of holding anything back here. People send us studies, we review them, and we will incorporate the findings from the MITRE study into our final study.
I now recognize the ranking member for questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Werfel, there have been a lot of false claims made about who the IRS will audit. I know you attempted a few moments ago to address some of that. But with the additional money from the IRA, how many armed revenue agents will be hired to accomplish these audits?
None, sir.
That's what I thought. So let me go over some other facts here. Last year, Secretary Yellen sent a letter to then Commissioner Rettig, a Republican, directing that none of the additional money provided by the IRA would be used to raise the historical audit rates on families and small businesses making under $400,000 a year. The former commissioner also sent a letter to Congress reiterating this fact. Without objection, I would like to enter both letters into the record.
So ordered.
Thank you. Commissioner, do you stand by the letter sent to Congress from Commissioner Rettig stating that audit rates will not rise relative to recent years for households making under $400,000 a year?
I do.
Thank you. Commissioner, with the additional money provided by the IRA, does the IRS plan to hire 87,000 revenue agents to carry guns to audit families and small businesses?
We do not.
Thank you. Commissioner, Americans are very tired of the two-tiered tax system that allows the wealthy and well-connected to play by one set of rules, while those who use withholding, they play by another set of rules. I have consistently stated that repealing the IRA additional enforcement funds will let the wealthy, large corporations, and tax dodgers off the hook. Last year, the committee reviewed the IRS mandatory audit program for presidents and found that it was not working as intended for a former president who operated a complex web of more than 500 businesses. Given this program, the fact that it was not working, how can we be certain that audits for other wealthy individuals are taking place, and how would the additional enforcement monies be used to assist the IRS with auditing complex returns?
Congressman, as I said earlier, the first thing that concerns me is the chasm between the number of IRS employees we have today to assess the number of high-wealth filers that are out there. And as a result, over the period of time from 2010 to today, there is a steep decline in the audit coverage of our wealthiest filers. And from my vantage point, one of the reasons why I came to the IRS and am excited about the job is thinking about honest taxpayers, those that own a small business, middle income, lower income. And right now, the IRS does have the capability to evaluate. We have that capability because those are simple returns. The returns that come in from our wealthiest filers are sometimes thousands, tens of thousands, and sometimes hundreds of thousands of pages long. And so when you have a team outsized, 2,600 personnel to 390,000 filers, and those files are not only voluminous, they're complicated. And multinational corporation, the way it's structured today, is more complicated than it was structured 10 years ago. Partnerships are becoming more layered and more complex, harder to find where the actual taxpayer is. We have to up our game if we're going to effectively assess whether these organizations are paying what they owe. So it's about hiring, it's about training, and it's not just hiring auditors, it's hiring economists, scientists, engineers, and when I mean scientists, I mean data scientists, to truly help us strategically figure out where the gaps are so we can close those gaps.
Commissioner, if the proposals that have come from the other side were to take place, including repealing the funding that came from the IRS, what would that prohibit you from doing in terms of modernization?
Yeah, this is very concerning because, as I said earlier, our base budget is about running the train schedules that we have today. You know, and if we don't fund our base budget, basically what I want you to picture is the platforms getting more and more crowded as the trains aren't coming and people getting frustrated. And that's not the way to serve taxpayers. That's our base budget. Our modernization budget, which is what the IRA provides, is how we modernize the whole system, how we improve everything about the system. So it's the difference, for example, between just having the person to answer the phone when it comes in for the IRS versus having the option to do a callback versus having a bot set up. So rather than wait, I can get my transcript by just hitting 1 or 2. It's the difference between just basic services and advanced services. And one of the concerns that we should all have, if you're a taxpayer, you should come to the IRS, which you're required to do to pay your taxes, and get the same level of functionality that you would from a bank, from an airline. And right now, because of steep cuts in our funding, we're not up to snuff with what taxpayers can see around the corner at their local bank. So we want to be able to do that. There's other, and I know I don't have enough time, but there's other ways we can spend the modernization money that is in the benefit of taxpayers, including securing data, and including, as I said, you can go to sleep at night knowing that the IRS has the capability to assess the wealthy in the same way we can assess middle and low income because we've built that capacity.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Buchanan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner. I know you're new on the job, and I guess the acting commissioner for about 6 months. But
8 months in 2013, sir.
But let me just mention, there's just a lot of misinformation out there and disinformation, whatever you want to call it. You know, they've got a budget. They originally set up an additional $80 billion, and now they're talking about another $43 billion. How do you distill that down? Where is the money going? And I just got to tell you, we've got to do you got to do a much better job in terms of communicating that, because the taxpayers want to know. I'm telling you, my district, but across the country, they want to know where the $80 billion plus another $43 billion would go, and you'll be the one to decide that.
Yeah, I would love the opportunity, and I appreciate the feedback of how we can be more effectively communicating the budget. So let me take a moment. What we're asking for in 2024 is $1.8 billion. That's what we're asking for on top of the base budget that we already have. And again, that's just to keep the current train schedules on target. What does that additional $1.8 billion do? About $1 billion of it is more people. More people to man the phones, more people to process transactions, and then about $800 million is mostly inflationary adjustments, pay increases. It's a large organization.
How much of that, the recruitment and stuff, is going to go into auditing? What's the percentage there?
For that, it's mostly taxpayer services. What we need in terms of more people. I can get you specifics on the percentage breakdown. The $43 billion metric, I just want to make sure is understood. What we're asking for in 24 is $1.8 billion, and that's really all I want to stand here and defend. Most of the money that's in that $43 billion is either already in our base or is way out in 2030, 2031, because as we move forward, there's a cliff that occurs.
Let me mention the reason I say that, because one of the commissioners in the past, I chaired oversight, we had a frank discussion, he brought up the idea for every dollar that you invest, we can get you back $5 or $6. It's set with me the wrong way. So I just want to make sure we're kind of get a better understanding of where the dollars are going, so we got a better sense of that. The other thing is some groups outside, conservative groups I would say, are estimating that, you know, people under 400,000, there could be as many as 650,000 audits. Do you have any sense of that, or is that something I can get to you?
I would love to better dig into the math. As I mentioned earlier, at least for the next several years, there will be no increase in the audit rate from the most recent rate that we have, which is 2018, which is a historically low rate.
The other thought is just on, before I got here, I was in business 30 years and dealt with obviously a lot of entities that were called pass-through. You're familiar with those, partnerships and limited partnership. Well, the idea that in terms of auditing, a lot of these are over that size. They're claiming that it could be millions or hundreds of thousands of organizations. And I just want to tell you, when you get, if it's a company that's got 100 or 50 employees and happens to make 400,000, it doesn't all go to the owner. But the bottom line is, and what I'm concerned about on these pass-throughs, when they do get a dispute or something with the IRS, is that you do everything you can to move that along and try to resolve it as quickly as you can, because it's very expensive in terms of CPAs and tax attorneys and the time taken away from their business. So I don't know what more you could do in that area. I'd like to see more resources put in that. So when you have disputes at any level, but especially small business and individuals, you do everything you try to resolve it. I'd make the best deal and go and get on to something else, but it's just my opinion.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I agree with it. When I made that analogy earlier of the train schedules and that we have to improve them, that's one of the improvements. We have to improve the ability to resolve issues quicker. First of all, it's one of the central Bill of Rights. We have a taxpayer Bill of Rights, and one of the rights is the right to quick resolution, and I want to meet that right. So, for example, we're putting into place, because of the Inflation Reduction Act, online accounts for both small businesses and individuals that will allow them to go in real time and see if they have an issue and have real time ways of solving it. So if we're successful this, it'll end the era of weeks and weeks of letters and correspondence back
Let me
and
just
forth
ask
with the
one
IRS.
quick, you made a comment about answering the phone.
Yes.
I think it's got a little better, but it's still unbelievable. I mean, people can't get through. It takes hours, and I just hear that in our office constantly. Now, maybe different parts of the country, it's different, but I'd like to have you make sure that whatever numbers you've got is an area you're working on, because people, their time is important. They want information. They want to resolve things with the IRS. They don't want sleepless nights. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Doggett is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for your service. You know, in December, this committee got a good in-depth look at the sorry state of high-end tax enforcement. After years of Republican obstruction from members of this committee, outside the committee, we finally secured some of the tax returns of ex-President Trump. As the public record reflects, and I refer only to the public record, there were years of paying little or no taxes, tens of millions of dollars in questionable losses carried forward from prior years, questionable foreign tax credits. We learned that the IRS had assigned a single auditor, one person, to review the returns of the Trump Organization's 500 entities. Even after that auditor indicated that he could not by himself do a really thorough audit, no one was assigned from the specialist referral system, and he appears to have been provided no reinforcements. Beyond the question of whether Trump himself got special treatment from his Republican appointees, and without asking you to comment on the returns of any particular non-taxpayer, the entire episode gives reason for concern that similar ultra-wealthy individuals who may well have committed tax fraud recognize that they, if they have enough high-paid accountants, tax lawyers, can get away with it. In reviewing the few available auditor's notes on Trump's returns, the Joint Committee on Taxation, as you're probably aware, faulted the IRS auditor for assuming that using high-priced accountants and lawyers ensures the accuracy of claim credits and deductions on returns. My first question to you is it standard practice at the IRS to assume that the ultra-wealthy can employ a tax consultant and just assume that the tax consultant said that the income and credits and deductions were accurate, that they are?
Well, again, Congressman, I appreciate the ability or the opportunity to clarify that I would never and cannot comment on any specific taxpayer, and my responses will relate only to generalities.
Sure.
The issue is, as I've been describing, it's the depletion of IRS resources has taken a toll, and it's taken a toll on our ability to do certain things, and one of them is to assess or unpack complicated, voluminous returns from our highest income filers, individuals, partnerships, and organizations. And, you know, whether you have the visual of a truck backing up with tens of thousands of pages for a given return, or the individual, or the visualization of a team of attorneys and accountants that a taxpayer might bring to the table, the reality is, and that's their right to do that, but we want to have an IRS that's resourced to ask the right questions, to challenge in the right issues, to make sure that there's fairness across the tax system.
Is it fair to say you would agree with the Joint Committee on Taxation in their analysis that they were not comfortable with any reliance on professional tax preparation as an indication of accuracy?
It's absolutely a trust but verify situation, and we need the ability to verify, and we don't have that right now.
And is it standard practice to assign one auditor to cover 500 organizations a taxpayer might submit?
Right now, Representative, as I said, we have 2,600 personnel for 390,000 of our wealthiest filers. So we have to make the smartest decisions we can, given that chasm. Hopefully, with the increase in resources, we can change that.
What are the factors that would cause an audit to remain unresolved for 7, 8, 9 years?
Complexity.
And again, a lack of resources.
Yeah, lack of resources, complexity.
If we eliminate all of the funding that you received as an addition last year as the very first bill that these Republicans passed in the House, will that facilitate this same kind of minimal enforcement with one auditor for 500 organizations?
It would. I would point this stat to you, Congressman. Audit rates in 2010 for entities, corporations between $100 million and $1 billion in assets range between 20 and 30%. Today, they hover near 5%. And if we don't have the resources, they will continue to hover near 5%, and that means we're leaving money on the table.
Thank you so much.
Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here today. I want to clarify, perhaps, there was mention earlier about special agents, especially within criminal investigation. Now, it's my understanding from a communication I received from your agency last fall that criminal investigation plans to hire 360 special agents per year over the next 5 years for an approximate net gain of 1,200 special agents considering attrition. Is that accurate?
That sounds about right. Again, Criminal Investigation Division, which deals with fraud and significant cases of tax evasion.
Correct. And those special agents are armed.
Okay.
Those special agents are armed. Is that correct?
They are armed. It's less than 3% of the IRS workforce.
And they avoid magnetometers at airports and things like that. So
they're law enforcement personnel.
now, you said earlier that you're not hiring any new special agents that will be armed, but it sounds to me like you are.
Well, my understanding, I'm glad you're clarifying. My understanding of the question was around audits. Our CI division, our Criminal Investigation Division, they do not conduct audits. What they do is they are investigating acute issues of fraud and tax evasion,
Okay.
and typically they're armed when they're putting themselves in danger.
I understood. I understand. But I think it's important to note that there is a difference. There will be new hires that will be armed, for the record. Now, last September, Secretary Yellen sent a letter to then Chairman Neal supporting Ways and Means Committee Democrats' efforts to provide additional funding for the IRS. I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to include that letter in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. In that letter, Secretary Yellen addressed the long-term decline in the number of auditors at IRS and provided data showing the decrease in the percentage of taxpayers audited across a number of filer categories between 2010 and 2018. Can you clarify whether 2010, the date put forward by Secretary Yellen in 2021, is the historical average you were referring to as a long-term goal, emphasis long-term goal, once IRS ramps up to audit high net worth individuals?
No, I would not clarify that. I would not characterize that as a goal. It's a benchmark. And we look at 2010 because that's the first year that started the steep decline in IRS resources. Okay. So we want to provide transparency to the American people that at the start of our decline in discretionary resources, this is what the world looked like in terms of audit rates.
Okay, and there's a lot of confusion here in terms of what a lot of these numbers are, but you know, there's consideration of income brackets, what those targets will be, and the percentage of taxpayers within each bracket who are being audited. But when you're attempting to adhere to the instruction, what metric will you actually be using? Will it be that distribution across brackets, or are there other numbers to consider?
I think what we would do, Congressman, is look historically at the type of coverage we had when we were at our healthiest. So, for example, if you look back at our audit rates when at our healthiest, we had fairly high audit rates for individuals with more than $20 billion, or companies with more than $20 billion in assets. We are more than half of that right now,
Okay,
and so I wouldn't call it a target, but it's a trend to make sure we're getting back to healthy levels.
Now, the Joint Committee on Taxation found that more than 90% of underreported income actually came from taxpayers earning less than $400,000. So how can we expect to generate $191 billion in new revenue over the next decade without drastically actually increasing the number of audits on families making less than $400,000, not even considering for the impact of inflation, since the president set the $400,000 threshold not long ago? I mean, the math seems to be difficult to reach.
Yeah, and this is a very important question, and I'm glad you asked it. Look, there is a lot of mounting evidence that there is significant underreporting or tax gap in the highest income filers. For example, there's a study that was done by the U.S. Treasury Department that looked at the top 1% of Americans and found as much as $163 billion of tax dodging.
Roughly 90% of the new audits, 90% of the new audits will be of those making less than $400,000. Is that correct?
No, none of the new audits will be of people earning under $400,000. So maybe I'm not understanding your question. There will be new audits under the Inflation Reduction Act, but those will all be focused on our highest wealth filers, individuals.
So the historic average is not relevant then, as referenced earlier?
Not for a number of years, no, it won't be.
Okay, I wish I had more time. Thank you.
Mr. Thompson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, thank you for being here. Commissioner, yesterday our Republican colleagues passed off the floor of the House a bill that slashed $80 billion in IRS funding that we had put in last year to help you solve some of these issues that have been discussed today. They made that cut saying that this was going to save money. It sounds like crazy math to me. Can you help us understand, when we fund you with proper funding levels, does that cost money, or does it allow you to recoup the money that's owed?
It allows us to recoup the money that's owed. There's long-standing historical and robust analytics that points to a return of $6 of return to the taxpayer for every $1 invested in the IRS budget.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that you cleared up this nonsensical argument that we heard continuously over the course of last year, that this $80 billion was going to pay for heavily armed agents running around kicking indoors. So thank you for that. I appreciate also the fact that we've made improvements in regard to customer service at the IRS, and I know all I have to do is talk to my district staff about how bad things were, and things do seem to get better. But I just want to say, you got some work to do. Last week, my wife spent 3 hours on the phone with the IRS, and she still hasn't gotten through. And most people, at least working people such as my wife, don't have time to spend. It was 3 different calls trying to get through, so she just didn't have time. People don't have time to spend an hour on the phone. So that.
Yes, Congressman, it's stories like that that is motivating. I know we have more work to do. But what worries me, Congressman, is if we reduce our funding, we'll hear more stories like that.
I get it. I get it completely. I just need to let you know that we've
Understood.
got more
I
work
like when people
to do.
tell me these stories because it's motivating.
Commissioner, we have some devastating wildfires in California, 2015, 2017, and 2018. Fire survivors throughout California received payments from an established trust after the Pacific Gas and Electric bankruptcy. My constituents and other Californians began receiving partial compensation from that trust in 2021, and they continue to receive payments today. None of the people that we're talking about will ever be made whole. They're going to get less money than it's going to take to repay to rebuild their homes and their businesses, and heavens knows what all they lost that are just irreplaceable. Now, in many cases, these folks are being told that they owe taxes on the payment they received from the trust, including taxes on the lawyers' fees, the lawyers that were associated with that trust. I have legislation with Representative LaMalfa that will make these payments non-taxable. And I appreciate that your staff has been working with mine on this issue, and I would ask that you will continue to work with Congress. This is wrong. This should not be like this. And I know the 2017 tax bill teed up some of this inappropriate taxation to take place, but we need to fix this. It's not a good situation for American taxpayers.
Understood.
Is that a yes? You'll work continue.
Well, I'm absolutely will work with you. One of the limits that I have as the IRS commissioner is not being able to comment on pro or con on legislative proposals, only to talk about whether it's administrable. I will say this, though. It's Treasury who...
I'll be satisfied with a yes. I'll continue to work with
Yes.
you on helping the taxpayers who are
Absolutely.
being harmed.
And we appreciate when we are provided tools to help taxpayers in need, especially those that are impacted by natural disasters.
Thank you. I also just want to say that Mr. Kelly, who's not here today, and I have legislation along with Chairman Wyden and Ranking Member Grassley over in the Senate to strengthen the IRS whistleblower program. We've got some common sense fixes that will strengthen that, help you guys out, and I guess it's not your policy to comment on legislation.
It's not my
but you can tell us if this will be helpful.
Yes, I can. We can work with you on that. You know, I will say we at the IRS will fiercely defend the integrity of the whistleblower process. We welcome suggestions on how to strengthen and improve it. So I'd love to work with you on that.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Schweikert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Commissioner, I have a fascination with the adoption of technology as a way to deal with so many of your issues. I have actually an IRS press release from just a couple weeks ago talking about your adoption of a chatbot for simple collection questions. Do you know anything about that?
I do.
How's it working?
Well, we have had a very successful filing season, as I understand it, with the introduction of new chatbots for things like getting a transcript, for things like setting up an installment agreement if you have less than $25,000. These are relatively $25,000.
And the article makes it clear. Your press release also makes it clear. It's relatively simple, but you've just engaged in an experiment of adopting the technology that we see much of corporate America moving to very quickly. Desperately, what can I do as a member of Congress on this august committee to help you do a hell of a lot more of this?
Yes.
The fact of the matter is, being someone who's been screwing around with ChatGPT since the end of last year, it is remarkable. I've had it write code for me. The fact of the matter is, you could build a stack in the IRS, and my ability to even ask complex questions, the ability to actually say, here's the discussion I can have, and over here is functionally the video on filling out the form. I guess I'm just desperate of what can I do to drag you in to the adoption of the technology that is truly customer-centric.
Congressman, I'm a convert. There's not a lot you have to do to convince me. And if my team behind me and those back at the IRS are watching, they're probably laughing because of how often in my first 5 or 6 weeks I've raised this exact issue.
So if I went online right now, though, and actually called in and talked to the chat, and you would direct me to, here's the video that would walk me through how to fill out the form in multiple languages, that exists? I looked for it last night and I couldn't find it.
When I think about a bot, I just want to make sure, like, if you call in the IRS 3 years ago and you need a transcript, you got in line with everyone else.
No, it's what
But not anymore.
I want to help you with this.
Yeah.
Because I also must tell you, I think it's insane you maintain your own servers. When you have substantial portions of the Department of Defense on highly encrypted cloud servers,
Yes.
and you want to keep your own server farm?
Not necessarily, no, we are in the...
Well, not necessarily yes or no. What can I do to help you to join this century of
Yes.
technology? Both the storage and your computing capacity. It's absurd that you still have that server farm in West Virginia. It really is.
First thing that you can do to help is make sure that we're not underfunded to modernize.
But stop. The migration, because we spent some time looking at your plan. I didn't see the migration away from all your own storage and all your own processing, because this is really expensive. I mean, you still are maintaining some AS400s and some of these things. That's insane what you have to pay someone to do that.
It's in there, Congressman. I will explain it if you give me 1 second.
please.
Which is, in the plan, we are committed to replacing our main core systems. The individual-
Stop. That's actually what I was going at. I don't want you to replace it. I want you to migrate out.
Yeah, that's one of the alternatives. I can't. We should talk offline about large capital technology transformation, because I want to make sure that I'm following best practice. And one of the things we need to do is an alternatives analysis. And I'm very interested, maybe as interested as you, in what the cloud-based, service-oriented architecture looks like as an alternative.
You do realize we're having a conversation that's a decade out of date.
I agree.
I mean, when the Department of Defense did this a decade ago, and you guys are still putzing around with it, and it's a conversation I had for the first week I was on this committee, and this isn't Republican or Democrat, it's just modern practices. It's just, we complain about resources and funding. People are really expensive, and the rest of the world, the rest of corporate and rest of other parts of government have made these migrations. I want to, and this is one, I want to help you. If it's resources, if it's talent, I want to help you do these migrations. But the fact of the matter is, this made me very happy that you guys put this out, because it's a demonstration you're at least experimenting with technology. But my pitch at the end here is a very simple one. So far, every witness here, part of the response is resources, resources, resources. Okay. Some of them are saying the modern use of the resources you have, you could dramatically cut your operational costs by moving into this century of technology. That's all, and I want to help.
I would appreciate that help. I would love to meet with you offline. One of the things I will walk you through is some successes that we've had on technology that we can build on. You've pointed to one, but there are others. But I am not disagreeing with you.
Okay, the last sentence is, I was underwhelmed with the vision on your migration plan. Okay, you had a sentence or two that were throwaway lines. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. I think it's enlightening to have a hearing and to re-engage with. We're from the IRS, and we're here to help. And I want to say at the start, I want to associate myself with the remarks of the Democratic leader, Neil, that he so artfully put out, but also talk about that service, and especially for the service, putting aside for a moment people earning above $400,000, but people who actually need the help, and the VITA program, which has been in place for a number of years. I can't tell you how successful that is and how we need to expand upon that. Is there something in the works to do that as well?
Yeah, I think about improved service as meeting taxpayers where they are and working with community groups, intermediaries to help us do that. VITA is an essential partner. They do incredible work. The number of times that VITAs are helping people file their taxes is increasing. The trend is going in the right direction. We're ready to partner and continue that trend.
I think that's an important thing and something we can learn in government. I hope, along with Dr. Ferguson, to talk about using a similar program with more than 10,000 baby boomers a day becoming eligible for Social Security, that there's also a tremendous need for volunteer help at no cost to make sure that people are getting the benefits that they richly deserve and need. It also brings to mind, et cetera, something like the passage of the child tax credit that's on the books and then off the books. And for so many families out there that were eligible that probably never even took advantage of this. And so again, giving new meaning to, we're from the IRS and we're here to help, and to augment your team also with volunteers, but making sure that you have the resources to carry out what the regular taxpayer needs to understand. And we have a chart behind us, and I want to commend you because we keep a record of, as I'm sure most members do the same thing, of the number of cases that we take up. And here, just in the area of tax filing, for the year we have what went on in 2022 and what transpired in 2023. And as you can see with the new resources, the tremendous effort that was put forward. As Mr. Thompson said, yeah, we can do better, and I hope that that's the plan as well. But between modernization and also having that human being there, the most frustrating thing I talk to our constituents is not having a person on the other end of that phone or being able to being able to talk to. The fact that you're open on Saturdays now as well and provide that opportunity. If you could comment on that as well, Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman.
I really appreciate the opportunity to comment. I mean, when we had lower resources, it was so frustrating for IRS employees, not just because we couldn't have the right amount of people on the phone, but also we couldn't do what we need to do as part of meeting taxpayers where they are and serving them effectively in underserved populations. So what funding allows us to do is to do what the base of what we're supposed to do, which is be there to answer the phone, but it allows us to lean in and provide a more fulsome service experience. That means meeting taxpayers where they are, allowing them, if they want to walk into a walk-in center, that walk-in center is open, staffed, and there's no line outside. One of the things we did, Congressman, is we've opened 16 additional walk-in centers this filing season. That would have not been, those are in local communities around the country. Some of the districts of the members of this committee. We could not do that without the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's really no agenda here other than to meet the demand of a very complicated tax system so that we can serve Americans effectively.
And it's a great thing for the American taxpayer to understand that you are from the IRS and you are here to help, and we need to take advantage of that. Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. LaHood is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Werfel, welcome. Thanks for being here today. Let me start by echoing the concerns of many of my colleagues on the supplemental funding for the IRS received last year in the Democrats' IRA that disproportionately focuses on audits and enforcement over customer service and technological modernization. Like anything in the federal government, things need to be made more efficient, more effective, and more accountable, and that concerns me. Law-abiding families and small businesses in Illinois need their tax returns processed and phone calls answered. And we've heard immense frustration here today regarding the lack of that being done. We don't need more IRS agents knocking on their doors with burdensome audits. I want to focus my time today, though, on a specific provision included in the IRA, the $15 million in funding to study the feasibility of implementing the free direct e-file tax return system at the IRS. We've heard that the study is on track to be shared with us next month, and that it's likely that the group Code for America would be involved in this endeavor. At this time, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from the Wall Street Journal dated April 26, yesterday, titled "Cooking the IRS Study Books, the Tax Agency Wants to Decide What You Owe Before You Do." So approved. Thank you. Thank you. With that, in that article, as I'm sure you're well aware, Commissioner, it outlines that the IRS direct e-file system and the pending feasibility study are of grave concern. And I guess I'm trying to figure out the general premise behind the direct e-file study. As I look at the extensive list of already existing problems at the IRS and your plans that you have to focus on the coming years, and the fact that free e-filing services already exist in the market today, as you know, tax preparation industry already provides free filing services for roughly 30 million returns each year. So I'm not quite sure why trying to tackle this concept in the near term would be beneficial to the IRS, or more importantly, to the American taxpayers. Now, I know you're new coming into this, and I heard your comments earlier before, but don't you think the e-file effort could lead to the IRS biting off more than it can chew with all those things that I mentioned that you talked about, further complicating the tax filing experience?
Well, I would start by saying we have a responsibility to provide to meet different taxpayer preferences. Not everyone wants to engage in the IRS in the same way, and not everyone has the means or the position to do so. So we have to create this menu. The menu includes walk-in centers. The menu includes our irs.gov platform, working with the Free File Alliance and the third-party preparers. It involves advancements on the smartphone, as Congressman Schweikert was holding up his. The question I think being posed here is this an additional menu item for certain taxpayers to avail themselves of if that's the way they prefer to engage the IRS, this direct file? So the Congress said, study it. And my understanding of the congressional provision is, what would it cost? What are the taxpayers' opinions on it? And then an independent assessment of its feasibility. And that's what we'll produce in mid-May, and we'll come and we'll talk about it, and you'll have more grounding to ask me the tough questions.
Well, I understand that, and I understand the study, but obviously you're the new commissioner. You've had opportunity to digest this and look at this. What is your opinion?
Well, I don't want to get in front of the report itself, because the report's not done, and I don't want to get out in front of a report that isn't complete. My take on it is I want to make sure that we are meeting customers, taxpayers in this case, where they are. I think it's a best practice for an organization to not have a one-size-fits-all. I don't know yet whether the direct file solution is the right additional menu item to put in place so that taxpayers that prefer to engage that way can do it. What I'd like to do is have the report issue and then engage in a conversation with the right set of stakeholders and figure out what the go-forward is.
Well, I would just say, and we look forward to that conversation, but it appears to me that it seems very problematic, and the focus on the IRS should be those things we talked about: prioritizing customer service, modernizing technology. You have enough to do there. And so, again, we look forward to getting that study back and look forward to trying to do all we can to help make the IRS more efficient, effective, and accountable to the American people. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Commissioner, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for taking what is arguably the most thankless job in America. I've had this conversation with a number of your predecessors, and I feel the same way. Anybody who's qualified to be appointed has lots of other career opportunities with less grief, less pressure, and probably more remunerative. So I really appreciate your willingness to take this assignment on, particularly considering some of the combative attitudes that you have to put up with. My experience with your employees, on balance, is one that is very positive. I routinely meet with Treasury employees in Oregon, and I found in the midst of the pressures that literally reduced them to tears because they couldn't answer the phone and get the job done. And Congress is complicit in this. Congress has routinely underfunded the agency, while all the time we make the tax code more complex and you have more returns to deal with. Just one question. Do you have 73,000 or 85,000 employees?
Today we have roughly 85,000,
Thank
which
you.
is still kind of at a level of staffing that's.
No,
Yep.
I hear you. Your reference here in terms of trying to meet the taxpayers where they are, I think is commendable. Are there other countries in the world that have an automatic system that provides taxpayers with their returns, that computes it for them?
There are other countries that have adopted that type of
Thank
system.
you. I don't find that particularly threatening. I will say that I wish people had the same ire against some of the private tax preparers who've been involved with tax scams that take advantage of taxpayers who aren't particularly sophisticated. You don't have to look very far to find taxpayers who are cheated by this industry. Not all, not many, but it is a not insignificant number. I appreciate what you were talking about, being able to equip the IRS to meet the challenge. I remember an article a few years ago that GE had 1,200, it was one of the largest law firms in the country, was their tax department. 1,200 tax attorneys for one corporation, filing, I imagine, extraordinarily complex returns. And to the point one of my colleagues made earlier, these are very difficult to move through. I meet routinely with CPAs and tax advisors and attorneys in my district, talking to them about the challenges. Most of them lament the understaffing and the inability of the IRS to be able to respond. And they acknowledge that audits largely are a thing of the past. Very few of them have clients that go through this. And they're talking about the most wealthy and privileged. So I appreciate the course you're trying to navigate here to try and equip the agency to meet the challenges. I think you said almost 400,000 very high wealth and expensive programs that are complex, and you have maybe 2,600 people. You know, not much larger than General Electric's former law firm dealing with these. I think it's an admirable challenge. I appreciate your being forthcoming with us, willing to work and explore these items. The things that my colleagues have raised, I think, are worthy to be looked at. But I do think we need to be mindful of the fact that this committee in the past did not cover itself with glory in terms of some pretty outrageous activities in terms of some of the hearings that we can convene and sensationalize them. I think we can do better than that, and I appreciate what you're trying to do, your attitude and cooperation, and look forward to working with you.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm grateful that we're having this hearing today. Commissioner Werfel, I want to thank you for being here. Look forward to working with you throughout and appreciate your candor today. And I do want to make a plug for my IRS advocate at home. I will tell you that we've had great success, good relationship working there. Sometimes it's unfortunate we have to go to the advocate as much as we do, but that cooperation has been good, and I just think it's good to give some good feedback here and there.
Great to hear.
The couple topics I'd like to ask you about today, so I'm just going to jump right into it. My staff back home has been working for several months now with constituents who are having trouble getting their employee retention tax credits released because they've contracted with a professional employer organization, or PEO, for payroll and related tax duties. And from what I understand, the PEO and IRS are following the law, trying to resolve the issue, but it's been more than 6 months of ongoing casework now, and it seems that the use of the PEO is what's delaying them from getting their tax credit released. And I know you mentioned before the phones being answered more quickly. Well, that's good. That's a good first step. But resolving the issues, too, is really the ultimate step. Yes. So if you don't mind, how is the IRS handling this PEO-related ERTC claims and the delays that are taking place?
Yeah, I am concerned about any time we have a backlog, and we need to focus on it. And what happened during the filing season is we moved and concentrated our personnel resources on the phone to make sure we were answering the phone. We've made progress on the backlog. During filing season, we were resolving and processing about 20,000 employee retention credits a week, but that was not enough to keep up with the demand because more come in. There's still eligibility through 2025, so this is a growing target, not a stable one. Now that the filing season is over, we can reset our staffing. I'm hoping that we can more than double the rate to closer to 40 to 50,000 resolved a week. Plus, we have teams looking at ways we can improve the process and be more aggressive in our efforts to manage that backlog. So it is an absolute priority. It's got my attention, and we're, and I'm holding people to more aggressive targets inside the IRS.
I appreciate that, and glad to have this opportunity to discuss the awareness of the issue that you seem to have. Shifting gears to IRS strategic operating plan, I want to ask you specifically about the energy security lines in the IRA allocations. Summary table on page 129 and the FTE table on page 131. For context, the SOP allocates just $3.2 billion to taxpayer services. Even the National Taxpayer Advocate noted in a recent blog post that the funding in this plan was, quote, disproportionately allocated for enforcement activities, and that the, end quote, and that the IRS needed to, quote, not lose sight of its core mission. So I look at the $3.2 billion allocated for taxpayer services, which is seemingly woefully inadequate as a share of the total funding here, and I'm wondering why more than 1/3 of that is earmarked for energy security, because the SOP lays out 5 transformation objectives: dramatically improve services, quickly resolve issues, focus, expanded enforcement, deliver tech improvements, recruit and retain a workforce. Those are all challenges, I get it. And then there's this energy security line item tacked on after those 5 objectives. And under the taxpayer services, this energy security is siphoning off $1.2 billion. Quickly resolving taxpayer issues when they arise for objective number 2 is another quote. Let me just cut to the chase. What specifically about those 1,800 new IRS employees, what will they be doing to support energy security that warrants a specific line item rather than funding improved tax administration through the 5 transformational objectives?
Yeah, it's a great question, and just lifting up for one moment, just the tax code is constantly changing, and the Inflation Reduction Act changing. But even before that, between July 2019 and December 2022, there were 950 amendments enacted under the Internal Revenue Code. And what that means is, and that's in Congress's wisdom and the President's wisdom to sign out those, what that means is it changes the forms, it changes the types of questions that we get, it changes the type of processing that we need to do, and we need to make those adjustments. The energy-related credits in the IRA are new, and there's some novel elements to them. And so we have to do what we're doing now, which is we've issued rounds of public comment, asked for information. We're doing advance and notice of proposed rulemaking. We also have to hire more people to be in the phone center because calls will come in with questions on, am I eligible or not? How is this working? New forms will come in that we'll have to assess. We'll have to have strong program integrity. So those funds are really dedicated to administration of these new tax provisions.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Werfel, Congratulations on your confirmation and hopefully a successful IRS filing season. I can't imagine the enormity of the job. We've had some hearings over the past session about the IRS. And I think it comes down to leadership. That's my opinion, my perception. I think you got great workers. They have to face a tremendous amount of filing and questions throughout the year, not just until April 15th, every year. The historic funding enacted in the last session empowers the IRS to answer phones and get refund checks out. And looking at the numbers, I think you put it in your testimony, I think we're going in the right direction. We have a long way to go, and you said that. I want to make writing out your taxes as easy as possible. We've promised that a number of times. We even had the postcard theory. Now we hear lip service about protecting working Americans from audits. Let's get that one thing straight. I believe there's been a sabotage of the IRS over the last years, and when Democrats were in charge, we didn't do much about it. Because you have to have a budget. You can sweet talk all you want. If you don't have the money, you can't get the resources. You marked 7 different places where you've improved in this year's filing season. Tremendous. And you've already got 117 million people who have filed. So we're halfway there. Because 50% of those folks got a check, a refund already. So we're ensuring working families face big audits while the rich get scot-free. Our hearing last year laid that out, and when you see in numbers, it's startling. Smearing fair enforcement is just code for protecting somebody. Commissioner, your predecessor shielded Donald Trump's tax returns for years. Whether he never read 6103 or not is still dubious. IRS began a ham-fisted audit the same day Chairman Neal made his appeal. It was clear, it was moderate, it was fair. Republicans did nothing while Trump's commissioner broke the law. Because you don't know the law exists or you don't know what the law says is not an excuse. 6103 is very clear, as the courts pointed out. And I don't want to hear that we went after Mr. Trump unfairly. Where the heck were these people 10 years ago when they investigated Ms. Lerner, who had your job, threw her out, and then exposed the names of 12 taxpayers who leaned to the left, whatever the heck that means, leaned to the left in the charities that they represented. I want you to comment to following our recommendations to clearly detail the mandatory presidential audit program in the Internal Revenue Manual. I've read it. Have you?
Yes, I'm familiar with the IRM on this.
Where are we?
Well, first, I'm required to clarify, of course, that any remarks that I make are prohibited to be attributed to any individual taxpayer.
Right.
We have a requirement amongst many in the presidential tax review program to review the taxes of a president. And I am in the process of understanding the different ways that the reduction in IRS resources have impacted our abilities to carry out a variety of different functions, including potentially this one. Congressman Pasquale, I think my answer for you right now is that I want to work with you and provide you more detailed updates on what we're doing on this program. But right now, there are a lot of different activities underway as we reset the priorities. And in particular, as I've mentioned several times in this hearing, we have a significant opportunity to change the way we assess the complex filings of the wealthy. We have capacities that we need to build, skill sets that we need to hire, resources that we need to put in place that right now we are not able to do the types of the review that I think middle and lower income Americans want us to be able to do to demonstrate that the tax system is fair. And so holistically, we're going to improve our overall efforts in this area. And then separately, I would like the opportunity to come back to you with an additional briefing on how that impacts anything related to the presidential tax review program.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Mr. Ferguson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, thank you for being here today. I've got a lot to cover and would like to jump right into it. I'm going to make a plea to you to help my constituents, all of our constituents, get their money back from the IRS and to get what's owed to them. I'm going to make a plea to you to help with the mental health of my district staff that works with your agency all of the time, and all of the district staffs, because they are losing their minds over the frustrations of dealing with things like a taxpayer advocacy service that simply is not responsive and not working. They are losing their minds over 4.5-hour courtesy hang-up calls. They are losing their minds trying to help my constituents day in and day out. And we have heard about all of these vast improvements, and I'm glad that somewhere in the rest of the country that's happening. So I'm going to beg you, if I get you certain cases or will you work with my staff to help get the folks the relief? Let me give you a couple of examples of why this is important. We had one small business that was looking for $1.4 million in earned income tax credits. Because of the delays, it cost $150,000 in interest. In 2021, interest payments grew to $3.3 billion, up 33%. I've got list after list after list here of the number of quarterly interest payments that, in just a very few cases that my staff works. Think about this. One of these interest payments could provide benefits for a Social Security beneficiary for maybe up to 6 years. Think about that. We're struggling to figure out how to pay to solve insolvency, to fix the insolvency problem with Social Security. And if you just fix one of these cases, we could cover somebody for up to 6 years. So will you work with my office to handle this? Because another case that's very interesting is that we have a letter. One of my constituents has a letter that says you are due a 7-figure refund. Says it from the IRS. And for 3 years, they can't get an answer on it. 3 years. So I'm proud that somebody's getting a little relief, but we ain't getting it down to the peach state. So will you help us? Will you please help my constituents and my staff?
Yes, you have my commitment.
Okay, good. Look, now here's the other challenge that we've got. This is the data that you provided regarding where the new hires in the IRS are going to be through fiscal year 31. This is the data that you provided, and we've just put it into a nice little graph form here. And so with this wonderful customer service that you have right now, and I say that very facetiously, what we see taxpayer services in the out years begins to drop significantly. So a bad problem's getting worse, yet the enforcement number is going straight through the roof, and operational support is coming down. Based off of where we are right now, this whole thing is backwards. You need to be funding taxpayer services a heck of a lot more, getting folks their money back, and you don't need to be going after the enforcement side the way that you are. So, I mean, this simply does not make sense. Every single person here is talking about the problems that they have, that their constituents have with the IRS in getting their money back. And yet, what we see from your own data is that this line is coming down. So this doesn't make any sense. So taxpayer services are going down, enforcement is going up. Just doesn't make sense. So one other issue that's out there, I'm going to bring your attention to, just get your thoughts on it. I guess maybe just get a commitment. You are not planning to implement a bank surveillance scheme with IRS that was proposed before that was not, but you're making no effort to implement.
That's correct.
Okay, good. So if you were a representative, and I know that you were the commissioner, but if you were a representative, you would have absolutely no problem with HR 1010, our bill that would prohibit the IRS from implementing that bank surveillance scheme.
Yeah, I defer to the Treasury Secretary on those types of questions.
Okay, well.
I'm just required to.
She was fairly non-committal as well, but it sounds like it's not something that you that
We have
that
no
you're gonna
intent
pursue.
of
So good,
going
you
back.
wouldn't have a problem with this. So I look at this and I look at these numbers and I go back. I look at the enforcement side of it in the out years. So you say, oh, don't worry about it here, nothing here. So we're going to have all of this enforcement. So the final question that I've got for you is, how many rounds of ammunition does IRS plan to purchase this year?
I can get back to you on that, but it's
Thank you.
not, it's not
Look
a
forward
lot.
to it. Because if you're not going to hire armed agents, it doesn't make sense for you to be hiring agents. But by the way, on your job posting board today, there's an application for armed agents. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, Mr. Werfel, let me congratulate you on your new assignment and say that I look forward to working with you. Secondly, let me thank Tracy Walker Carter and your SPEC team for their efforts to help foster and homeless youth better understand tax resources. I know how much the Earned Income Tax Credit expansion helped homeless and foster youth in 2021. Given its expiration, I'm very grateful that the Internal Revenue Service has continued its outreach to help these vulnerable youth. Third, I've got to tip my hat to our new Chicago taxpayer advocate, Vice Ola Baramio, and her team were very helpful to my office and to my constituents. Mr. Commissioner, I would appreciate your updating me with some information when it's available. In particular, when the IRS has data on tax year 2021, I would appreciate reports about the benefits of the expanded Earned Income Tax Credit, the CTC, and the CDCT in 2021. This information will greatly help us better understand how these credits impacted families and workers. And finally, like other systems in our country, the seemingly race-neutral tax policies and audit practices can have a substantial disproportionate impact on taxpayers of color. I'm glad that the Internal Revenue Service is beginning to examine these disparities, and I hope that you will keep me updated about this work and any legislation that may be needed to build on these efforts to ensure that our tax code applies fairly to all taxpayers. And I thank you and look forward to your response.
Thank you, Congressman. And I will provide you with those updates. And we are working in response to a request from Senator Wyden, Chair of the Senate Finance Committee, on an assessment of the report that I think you were alluding to with respect to potential disparate impact of IRS audits on racial minorities. Once that report is complete and we've since submitted it to Chairman Wyden, I'd be happy to come and brief you on its findings and what we're doing to move forward from here.
Thank you very much. And while all of your offices throughout the country do outstanding work, there are none that does what the office in Chicago does. They're the best. Thank you very much.
Noted.
And I yield back.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner Werfel, for joining us today. You know, as a new commissioner, I know you have your work cut out for you as far as things going on, and you know, I look forward to working together to help clarify the agency's priorities and deliver a better experience for taxpayers. And at the end of the day, helping them retain as much of their income as possible after they worked for it, and paying the taxes is a task that we want to do as part of our country and the process we have here. We're all aware that tax day was last week, and I know that it's fresh on the Kansas minds about how much money had gone into the federal government in Washington, D.C. via their taxes, and they want to know and have a right to know that their hard-earned dollars are going and where they're going and what's being used for. And that's true across federal agencies, any agency that exists in the federal government. I want to talk a little bit about, you know, instead of increasing the audits on ordinary Americans, what's the IRS doing about dedicating their efforts to help focus on security and protocol? Given some of the major leaks of confidential information that's happened in recent years, you know, it's been nearly 2 years now since ProPublica published confidential information obtained through a massive leak, and still no one's held accountable. And just last week, the IRS disclosed confidential information contained in a Form 990T when it was not once but twice posted on online. And you know, mistakes like this don't inspire confidence that the IRS can be trusted with the secure, confidential taxpayer information. So why is it that nobody's been held accountable for the ProPublica leaks? And you know, as the new commissioner, will you commit that you know that you're going to focus on finding why these leaks occurred and will work to make sure that they don't happen again?
Well, let me start, Congressman, by saying, and I mentioned earlier, how important data security is. And when I first was approached about doing the IRS job and I sat down to get ready for my Senate confirmation hearing, I wrote down what are the most important implementation factors, and the first thing I wrote in tax administration is data security. It is the topmost priority. And as I mentioned earlier, in my early weeks here, I'm trying to figure out and determine what's our state of the union in terms of data security. Where do we have strength? For example, right now, I'm comfortable with our cyber profile in terms of what we're doing, but we need to stay ahead and keep investing in the right solutions. And there are areas, as for example, there are several TIGTA recommendations that we have not done yet that we need to do, and I want to close those gaps, and the Inflation Reduction Act provides us the resources. With respect to the specific issue that you raised, it's my understanding that the issue has been referred to the Inspector General. And the appropriate protocol for me at that point, once an issue's been referred to the Inspector General, is to stand back, let the Inspector General do any review that they deem necessary, and to offer to the Inspector General any support that is needed from me. And I had a general conversation with Russell George early in my term that confirmed my understanding that my role is to refer issues, let him do his work, and when he needs my help in investigation, I will be there to help him.
Which is great, and we want to make sure that inspector generals are able to do their job wherever the work that they're doing. I guess the frustration that we feel is now 2 years in, we're hearing this constant story, there's an investigation underway, and we're not hearing anything. And are you getting updates from the Inspector General? Are you having meetings, or you have a schedule that you'll get together every 3 months, every quarterly, get an update, or what's the process there?
Typically in any investigation, what the Inspector General will provide is immediate input to us if there's an action that we can take to close a critical gap. Let's say they're doing a review of a system for security. They won't wait 5 months and say, we see a gap. they'll come to us early and say, we see a gap, even though the study's not done yet, or the audit or the investigation. So anything that the Inspector General tells us mid-audit or mid-investigation is for us to take an immediate action. And I think in general, broader than there are ongoing Inspector General reports on data security and ongoing recommendations that were in place for years that haven't been closed, and my focus is on closing those.
Well, and that's good. I guess there's just a frustration. It sounds like this is being swept under the rug. 2 years now, nothing happening. So I know I'm about out of time. I've got so many other questions. You know, one of the things that concerns me, and I know several members already talked about it, is the Inflation Act, when it came out, only dedicated $3.2 billion out of the $80 billion for support and customer service. And that's a concern I think that a lot of us have. So my time's expired, but I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, thank you for drinking from a fire hose for the first 6 weeks of the new job and sitting here for almost 2 hours now. I probably have another couple hours to go here. But you know, the IRS is something that's, you know, most people out in America, I'm sure you've heard this, kind of considers the boogeyman, and sort of a place to be. In the last 2.5 years, you know, every congressional office has acted as the customer service reps for the IRS, trying to reach out and find people. And when I say find, I mean, let me get my Oklahoma accent, find with a D on the end, not fine with an E on the end. And you know, a lot of when you talk to preparers, a lot of that is due to the fact that, you know, you couldn't get answers to, you know, certain things on the returns, and then people would make adjustments, and they'd find out after a period of time that there were penalties, and so we're trying to get penalties abated and things of that nature. So, you know, I'd hope as you work through this, there's some consideration as that as well. I want to ask you a couple questions here in the time I have remaining. You know, we talk about the IRA and their allocation. When you look at the tax credits and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, it's been widely reported that the green energy incentives in the IRA will cost us astronomically more than originally scored last year. The JCT and Congressional Budget Office scored the tax credits last year to be $271 billion. Yesterday, JCT amended that score, and now the IRA tax credits will be $570 billion, more than double the original cost. And this score does not include an update for the EV credits, but Goldman Sachs has said the provision costs $392 billion, which is 28 times more than the original score of $14 billion. Now, we know implementing these tax credits or tax incentives will also be far more expensive than we've ever imagined. In fact, when you look at the Omni last year, the Omnibus bill, it allocated $500 million for the IRS to implement these provisions. However, when we look at this in the Bloomberg tax article, it says it's going to cost $3.9 billion. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there between what was originally appropriated and what you're saying you need. First of all, I guess part of my question is can you explain why it's 8 times more than expected? And are you seeing potential for abuse in these hundreds of billions of dollars in credits? And with the cost of the bill going up almost daily, in fact, your current estimate of $3.9 billion, as said, is that even accurate now? And if you could answer that, I've got one more question as it relates to that.
Yeah, so I'll try to provide some clarity on that. There are funds that are in the Inflation Reduction Act that are necessary to administer the energy credits. We also felt that we needed additional funds in our base funding. So again, this is a point that the Inflationary Reduction Act funding sits on top of our base funding. Our base funding is roughly, at this point, $12 billion a year, and we've asked for $1.8 billion increment for '24. Within that $1.8 billion increment is $100 million to pay for additional people to be on the phones for energy credit-related questions. So what you're seeing over the 10-year period is the full cost of what the IRS feels is necessary to administer the energy credits that were in the Inflation Reduction Act.
So with the ever-escalating anticipation of the take rate of those EV credits, we've heard this widely reported outside of any governmental agency, does that mean that you're going to have to come back for a second bite at the apple as this continues to rise and more people are taking, which is going to generate more and more questions and more oversight?
I'm not sure. I mean, this is why we have this annual budget process, is to figure out if the world changes, exigent factors, assumptions that we may have made that were incorrect. But based on our best assessment right now, we've provided you the best understanding we have of what the cost to the IRS will be over the life of the Inflation Reduction Act to administer the energy-related provisions.
So currently, there are already tax credits out there that are energy
Yes.
tax credits. And so is this 500 incremental just to
Yes.
handle the new EV credits? And so do you
That's
feel
correct.
like you're adequately doing oversight and answering questions on the existing with what your current budget is?
We currently have budget to administer the credits. As you've heard earlier, we haven't had sufficient resources, and therefore we have a backlog for some of those credits. So the idea with our funding plan is to make sure that we are in a state of readiness for the changes that have been made to the Internal Revenue Code so that we can administer it. But yes, we already do manage energy-related credits. The Inflation Reduction Act expands the number of credits or the types of credits that are available, and thus we have to adjust our operations to accommodate that.
So this $3.9 billion that you have set aside right now in the $80 billion, that's what you anticipate based on the original projections of the EV credits. This take rate increase, which again will be more individuals taking it, more businesses. When you come back for your next budget,
If we felt that we didn't have enough operational resources, we would come back and ask for a plus up, yes. I mean, and it's not, and again, I go back to, there's no agenda here. We just want to make sure that we can meet the demand of American citizens who come to the IRS for help.
well, I guess, Mr. Chair, if I may, just the point being with this is as these costs rise outside of your control, your responsibility is to do oversight, answer questions.
Yes.
So the point being here is that as these costs rise, there are other ancillary add-on expenses to the American taxpayer, not just what the allocation of the EV credit is, but the oversight of those credits, the administration of those credits
Yeah.
that are going to impact the American taxpayer. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Sanchez from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you, Commissioner Werfel, for being with us today. It really can't be overstated how challenging last tax filing season was for our constituents, and that's why I, along with others, led a bipartisan effort last year to try to urge Treasury and the IRS to give taxpayers some breathing room while the agency tried to dig out from that enormous backlog. And it wasn't the IRS's fault that there was a global pandemic, and it wasn't the IRS's fault that after years of being demonized and attacked and underfunded, the agency just didn't have the capacity to keep up with all of the extra strain and complexity. So I do want to take a moment here to appreciate how far we've come since then. We still have work to do, but it's, from dramatically improved individual and business backlogs to just being able to talk with a live IRS employee, we are in a much, much better place. And I want to thank you and the employees of the IRS who've been working nonstop to get us to this point. I feel like we don't thank IRS employees enough for the work that they do that is often thankless. Commissioner Werfel, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are sort of constantly repeating the false claim that the IRS is planning to send hordes of agents after working families using the funding that we passed under the Inflation Reduction Act. And in reality, the fact is that the lowest earners, who are disproportionately people of color, are already audited at far higher rates than wealthy taxpayers, and that's because it takes, as you said, a lot more resources to audit a single wealthy taxpayer who can afford a skilled accountant and who has, many complexities going on in their returns. So it's kind of interesting that the first bill this Republican majority passed was to gut IRS enforcement funding, and what that would have is the practical effect of protecting very wealthy tax cheats who can use the complexities to their advantage. I wonder if you could expand on the differences in time and resources that it takes to audit a millionaire compared with filers who are at the lowest income levels.
Yes, thank you for the question. As you know, most of Americans file, their single source income filers. Most of their taxes are administered through their payroll. It's a very straightforward operation. When we have multi-source income, like large partnerships, corporations, billionaires, and multimillionaires, it takes up to 50 times longer for the IRS to assess, examine, or audit those returns. And that's due to their volume, their complexity, to even put more of a fine point on it, it takes about 5 hours on average to audit a middle and low income taxpayer when those audits do occur. It can take 250 hours or more to audit wealthy or more complex filings. So it is a much harder job, and it requires a specialized skill that has deteriorated at the IRS while the complexity of these organizations have increased. So we have a lot of work to do, and that's, if you're a mom and pop shop, if you're a middle income individual, the message that the IRS has for you is the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be focused for you on improving your service. That's where our focus is.
Great. And
the
auditing
efforts and enforcement will be on these very complex returns for the wealthiest taxpayers, individuals, corporations, and partnerships.
Perfect. Thank you. Commissioner Werfel, if my colleagues were to succeed in cutting the Inflation Reduction Act's funding, what would that mean for the IRS's ability to improve audit rate disparities and make it harder for wealthy filers to game the system if your funding is cut?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier, our audit rates in 2010 for corporations between $100 million and $1 billion in assets ranged between 20 and 30%, and now they're hovering near 5%. So we're not doing enough to assess. And when you don't do enough to assess, you create risk. You create risk that the laws are not being followed, especially if there's a sense that no one's ever going to look at what we're doing, and so then you can be more risk preferred in how you file. This is something that we can never perfect, but if we have the right amount of resources and if we're effective at looking at these complex returns, then we can rebalance that. And they'll take less risks, and that will be beneficial to the U.S. government's bottom line.
Great. I want to just briefly touch on another issue, which is the reporting threshold for folks who report business income on the 1099-Ks.
Yes.
If we raise the reporting threshold to a more reasonable dollar value without reinstating the 200 transaction requirement, will we still see greater reporting of true business income while avoiding some needless confusion?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would answer that question is the way in which the law was enacted is extremely complicated, and we're learning in real time. It was complicated for the IRS to administer, and it was complicated for employers to determine how to work with third-party pay providers to make it all work. So as you know, we took a pause, and in retrospect, we want to get better and better at not having to take pauses and planning better. But this provision turned out to be way more complicated than was anticipated. So anything that can be done to change the dimensions of how complicated it is would be helpful for the way we administer. The question is a broader tax policy one that is best answered by the Secretary of Treasury. But in terms of the question of would it help with the simplicity of administration, yes.
Great. I appreciate that, and I yield back.
Thank you. And now I'll yield 5 minutes to Ms. Miller from West Virginia.
Thank you, Chairman Estes, and thank you for being here today. The IRS is facing many, many hurdles, and I don't think your job has gotten any easier in the last year or two. I wish you the best of luck in taking on this huge challenge and facing what you have to face, and I encourage you to do it transparently and as productively as you possibly can. I've been working to solve an issue for over 2 years that was caused by the incessant greed of the current administration for our tax dollars. It involves the lowering of the threshold for taxpayers to receive a 1099-K form and moving it back to its original intent. The lowering has created significant challenges for taxpayers, small businesses, and payment processors, along with the IRS, because President Biden needed to pay more for his agenda. Luckily, though, we avoided an imminent disaster because of the delay in implementation last year. It saved an estimated 40 million taxpayers from a tsunami of impossible paperwork. And I'd like to remind you that it is the role of Congress to make policy, and it's the role of the IRS to implement it, not upside down. Last year, the IRS cited the difficulty in administering the program as one reason for this delay, and the IRS did have a full year to send taxpayers a bill that they likely really didn't owe, and the agency wasn't really prepared to handle that type of a burden. If this policy was too difficult for the IRS to get right in that year with all your new employees, some of whom still are not back in the office, I believe, how do you expect an individual who is selling a bicycle or paying their rent as a group to handle the cost and the compliance burden?
You know, I think one of the most important principles of tax administration is that taxpayers have clarity on what is expected of them. And sometimes a law change in the Internal Revenue Code, sometimes we can administer it fluidly without any impact on the clarity. And sometimes the change is complex to administer. In this case, we were not ready to administer in a way that provided taxpayers the clarity they need. So we paused it. This was before I got there. I think it was the right decision, though, to pause it. Now we have work to do, and we're working very closely and engaging all the stakeholders to figure out, because the law hasn't changed yet, it's still the same law, how do we, when we resume next year, do a much better job in providing the type of clarity? What are the questions we need to answer? What are the flexibilities we need to explore? We're asking all those questions of your constituents and other stakeholders around the country, and I'm hopeful that we're going to get it right this time. But I will say again, it is complicated to administer.
Absolutely. Would the IRS welcome Congress raising that threshold back to the time-tested standard of 20,200 separate transactions?
Again, as I said earlier, I cannot opine on the wisdom or the preference of a particular policy outcome, but I will share that a change in the threshold would be easier to administer. And so at my seat at the table, I'd say the IRS would have an easier time administering it.
Thank you, because then my next question would be, do you have a plan to delay it again if indeed nothing had happened, but I'm hoping it will happen with this bill. And I also want to thank all my Republican colleagues who had signed on to the bill, and I certainly hope that my Democrat colleagues will do so as well in order to protect our constituents and make life a little bit easier while we support what we can support. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. And now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for coming. Heard good things about you, and I know you've just been 2 months on the job. Congratulate you for going and being a Tar Heel undergrad. I'm sorry you couldn't get into a real graduate school as you had to go to Duke. So, anyway, har. Look forward to positive things, and I actually believe the IRS needs more people, 100%. But I just want to follow up, because this chart is concerning to me. Can you just comment on that? Because, you know, it shows an absolute meteoric rise in enforcement, and we're not pushing people to take care of our taxpayers. Yeah. Can you briefly comment on this?
Yeah, well, yes, thank you for the question. My job is to do both, actually to do all three. The job of the IRS is to serve Americans and help them with their tax obligations. It's to enforce the code and make sure people pay what they owe. And then obviously we need a foundation at the IRS that's stable and operates.
But right now, I mean, I'll just ask you this. Do we need this many more enforcers rather than that many more people to take care of taxpayers?
I will say, Congressman, I am concerned with the chasm that exists today between the number of people we have to assess and unpack complex filings of very wealthy Americans, and therefore I believe we're going to put those enforcement dollars to very good work and make a lot of Americans proud in terms of how we equitably...
Well, I would say this, and we can get off this, but you know, you've heard from both sides of the dais here, both sides talk about absolute, unbelievable taxpayer frustration. And I think that needs to be the number one priority that you have. We are in the business of customer service, and everybody in government should be. and that's customer service. All right, thank you. Let me just ask this. You've been saying a couple times, about the $400,000 limit, that you wouldn't get working on those individuals to tax them to audit for a while. When I have patients come in and I say, how long has it been hurting? How long have you been doing this? They say a while. And I say, is that 2 weeks, 3 months, 5 years? How long's a while? Can you give me like 2 years, 2.5 years? Can you give me a number?
Yeah, I would say that that if I'm fortunate enough to still be in this seat in 2026, we should sit down and talk through where we go from there, because I think
so you're going to say 4 years. Those people are going to.
I would say in the 3 to 4 year time frame, I will have enough information in the capacity building that we're doing for high income filers that I'll be able to turn to you and say, okay, what's next?
All right. Do you have a percentage that you have a close that you say Americans are not honest on their taxes? Let's just be true. Let's see what it is.
My understanding, it's roughly 85% of taxpayers come in.
So you would say 85% of the people on this diet. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Okay, so that's an alarming number. In some ways, it's not alarming. In other ways, it's sad. It's whatever. So let me just ask this, because we always hear about this fair share thing. What percentage of tax receipts come from those who make the top 1%?
That I'd have to get back to.
It's like 45%. I mean, the top 1%. And the bottom 50%, we all know, hardly pay any taxes at all. I just want to put this in relative terms.
Yes.
I'm not saying we should not go after people, the multi-billionaires who, make all this money and pay relatively small amounts. But when they say the fair share, come on, Joe, let's get real. I mean, it's just, when you're paying almost half the tax burden, the top 1%, let's just be real. And I just want to be fair about those things. Let me get back to just one other thing. Let's see how much time I have. You talked about that you need about 2,900 employees to audit the 390,000 wealthiest, and that's about a roughly one.
We have 2,600 today.
2,600. I'm sorry. And that's roughly about a 1 in 150 ratio.
Correct.
Let's flip that. Let's look at the people that make under 100,000. What's the ratio there?
Oh, it's much, much, much higher in terms of because there's so many more Americans that make under 150,000, and so, but it's a different challenge. In other words, you have a return that comes in that's just a couple of pages versus a return that comes in 100,000 pages. It's just kind of optimizing the staffing that we have for the challenge of the materials that are coming in. And most middle and low income files process very quickly, very easily, especially if they file electronically. We run our math checks and we run, an automated review, and many of those filings just go through, and hopefully if they file electronically and direct deposit, they're getting their refund within 21 days at this point.
All right.
The reason we need a lot of people is because for billionaires and large multinational corporations, it's just a complicated return.
Understand. I absolutely understand. But you also need, I'm not going to say need to understand, surely understand that especially in the last 2 years, the American people are tired of government overreach. Now you can't have a puddle on a farm with it being regulated by the Biden administration. You can't have a boat that speed is not regulated. You can't do so many things. They feel the federal government needs to be in every single pocket of Americans and every single thing that you do. So when you hear the IRS knocking on the door, when you see the differential on that slide that graph that shows so many more people knocking on your door, it scares the hell out of the American taxpayer. So please give us some reassurance that we're going to come back to the fact that we want to be customer service first rather than law enforcement agency.
We have a lot of work to do on customer service in the strategic operating plan that we issued on April 6th. There's roughly 200 projects. I referred to it earlier as my public to-do list. A lot of that is about changing the way we serve Americans by opening up our taxpayer assistance centers, answering phones better, putting on tools on their smartphones and on our website. There's a lot of focus on that. And yes, there's $3 billion to do that. And we have the challenge that we have.
But you have $46 billion for enforcement.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I've probably gone all my time here, but boy, it doesn't pass the smell test. Thank you. You got a hard job, but I would say if businesses ran their business like the federal government runs its business, we'd be bankrupt. Oh, by the way, we are bankrupt. So thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. Thank you. And now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Brookings Institute came out with a report that said over the past 10 years, $7 trillion of taxes that were owed were not paid. Is that an accurate figure?
If I'm doing the math right, our tax gap assessment is roughly $500 billion a year. So if you multiply it by, you get into the trillions once you start multiplying that over a 5, 10, 15-year time frame.
So if nothing changes over the next 10 years, how much money will be lost in revenue of taxes that are owed but not paid?
If nothing changes, about $5 trillion.
Okay. So that's $12 trillion over the past 20 years. There's a lot of talk here about concerns about a debt. The national debt, which is $31.6 trillion, well, there's 12 of it, right? And, you talk about one of your main objectives is to enforce the tax code. But obviously it isn't being enforced fairly to include everybody. Now, a teacher will pay about 22% in federal taxes. 50 American corporations that are recording record profits pay nothing, and many of them get a return. The 1960s Harvard economist Peter Drucker said the whole point of creating an economy is to create a middle class because they fight our wars. They teach our kids, they build our roads and bridges, and they pay our taxes. Your predecessor, one of your predecessors that may have been once removed, came to a Senate hearing 2 years ago and put the number of taxes that are owed but not paid at $1 trillion. It's a lot of money. And you can't, at the same time, talk about debt and deficit and with any credibility not be bullish about collecting this money that is fairly taxed against corporations for income taxes that are reporting billions of dollars of profits. So I would just want to make very clear, this is not about enforcement. This is not about meeting taxpayers where they are, because I'll tell you where they're not. They're not in corporate America. And if you look at the list of these corporations, Amazon, first of all, in 2017, we lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, right? Well, Amazon, the next year, paid 6% in corporate income taxes. ExxonMobil paid a little less than 3%. AT&T got a rebate of $1.2 billion. Ford paid 1%. Charter Communications got a rebate of $1.2 million. An American teacher pays 22%. 22% in federal income taxes. So the problem here, it's not really customer service. It's about the fair, not aggressive, but the fair enforcement of the U.S. tax code, which this committee is primarily responsible for. So I know I threw a lot out there, but the Institution on Taxation and Economic Policy says that at least 55 of the largest corporations in America, largest 55 corporations in America paid 0 federal income taxes. Teachers pay 22%. Sir, this is not a customer service problem. This is a fairness problem. And the middle class is getting screwed again. And there is no denying it. If it's not $7 trillion in 10 years. There are many other reports that you could point to, as you know, that put the number at $10 trillion a year. Some put it at $6 trillion a year. But these are trillions of dollars that contribute to the federal debt that this body has been preoccupied, obsessed with over the past 48 hours. So I yield back.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for appearing today. I asked this, and I realize you're less than 2 months into the job, but I want to follow up, if I can, about the ProPublica leaks. Based on what you know now, do you think that the controls and the protocol are in place today to prevent another type of ProPublica leak?
It's a very good question. I said earlier a couple things. I said data security is a top priority, and it is. I said I'm in the process of assessing where our strengths and gaps are, and I am. There are gaps. And I want those gaps to be closed. And I've asked the team to put together an action plan, and I'm really leaning on TIGTA because the Taxpayer Inspector General basically gives us the roadmap. They have recommendations. As long as those recommendations are open, I think we have a higher risk than we should have. And so the way I'd answer that question is we have risks to mitigate, and I am prioritizing mitigating them.
You can appreciate why those types of leaks are a concern not only to wealthy Americans, but to all Americans.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. We sent a letter, Congressman Ferguson, who questioned you earlier, and myself, to your predecessor and to Secretary Yellen on October the 6th regarding the employee retention tax credit.
Yes.
So I appreciate the letter was not sent to you, it was sent to your predecessor. It regards the number of backlogged Form 941 claims. I think at that time when we sent the letter, there were a little over 200,000 unprocessed forms. The number today is substantially higher. Again, I understand we sent the letter to your predecessor and not to you. My question is, first of all, based on what you know, can you address the backlogs and the status of the backlogs?
I can. Look, without, it's absolutely important that speed in processing is done. I think taxpayers expect and demand that when they file for a credit, that it's going to take a reasonable time, not an unreasonable time for the IRS to process it. The employee retention credit has two particular challenges, probably more, but I'll highlight two of them. One is that it turns out to be an extremely difficult credit to process because it impacts multiple tax years. So the individual at the IRS that has to process it has to make sure they get the information right in each of the right tax years. That takes time, it takes expertise, and in order for the credit to register, we have to get it right. The second is it's a problem with the number of fraudulent credits we're getting in. So we're having to set aside credits that just don't seem to add up, and it's clogging the system a bit. These are not excuses, these are just realities. I have still made it an absolute commitment to drive that backlog down. Earlier in the hearing I mentioned, during the filing season, we were processing about 20,000 a week. Now that filing season is over and we can reset staff a bit, I've asked the team to up that to double that rate. And I'm happy to come back and report to you periodically on whether that direction that I've given and whether the impact is bearing fruit. I expect it will.
I appreciate that. If I could ask you, again, it was sent to your predecessor, the letter's dated October 6, 2022.
Mm-hmm.
If you could respond to the letter
yes.
laid out in the letter.
I will.
Lastly, lots been asked about the new employees and the enforcement agents, enforcement staff, however you want to characterize it. Let me just ask you, whether they're armed, unarmed, whatever, who are you looking for? I mean, what are their, on the enforcement staff, the enforcement agents, what are their qualifications? What's their background? Who are they?
Question. So under the Inflation Reduction Act, our focus is to rebuild our capacity to unpack complex filings. To do that, we need people that understand how these filings are put together. So we need expert accountants, we need expert economists, we need data scientists that can help us analyze trends in economic behavior so that we can understand where there might be risks of balances owed that haven't been paid. So we're looking for a pretty sophisticated group of employees that can help us unpack sophisticated returns. And that's the focal point. And look, there are labor market realities that are challenging. We have to improve our overall human capital operations. People have said this is a hard job, and it is, but I have confidence that we're gonna get this done.
There's a shortage of accountants.
We have a shortage of a lot, but that doesn't mean we're not putting a full court press in play to make sure that we get the right staff at the IRS.
Recent report said that more than 300,000 accountants and auditors quit their jobs in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Thank you. I yield back my time. Thank you, Commissioner.
Mr. Arrington is recognized.
Commissioner, good afternoon. Thank you for your time. So I serve with some of my colleagues here on the Budget Committee, and trying to do the math here on the numbers and then connect the sources to uses. $12 billion, I think, before IRA annual budget, and then you've got the $80 billion from IRA. That's $8 billion a year. So you've 75–80% increase, and then in the president's budget this year, there's another 15% increase. So
correct.
And then the first $8 billion a year coming out of the IRA was for compliance and enforcement. The analysis on 2010 audit rates and the historic data from the IRS suggests that the audits would result, or the additional audits with the additional monies would result with 1 million more audits per year, and that of those 1 million additional audits, 600,000 would be people, individuals, families making $75,000 or less a year. So that'd be certainly over half, maybe as high as 2/3 of your audits, 1 million more on people making $75,000 or less. That's using IRS historical data. Is that consistent with your analysis of your own
That's not
information?
consistent with our plans. I want to unpack your math a little bit, or the math that's been presented, and I appreciate the question because I think it's important to clarify for middle, low income, and small business what the plan is. But the plan, as I've mentioned, is to focus our enforcement efforts on complex returns of high wealth filers. And with respect to those making less than $400,000, you can go to the 2018 audit rate, and that's all we're going to audit to, at least for the next several years.
And Commissioner, you can imagine how concerned people are that with your past practice, if that's any prediction of future behavior, they see a deluge of new audits on working people, on small businesses, and they're having to hear the line, "We're from the government, we're here to help, and you can trust us." I mean, and listen, I'm not questioning your commitment or integrity, but I think too often we take the American people for fools, and they are just going on their past experience and the data. So I, certainly hope that the commitment's genuine and that the fulfillment of that commitment is consistent with what you're saying, because I find that unacceptable. And if you're going to focus on the more complicated and the high net worth individual, I don't see any justification for the $8 billion a year and then the president's budget asking for 15% more increase. Now, I'm not asking for you to respond to that. If I may, let me jump to another question. Seemed a little unrelated to that one, but another concern. I was at the Rules Committee talking matters of budget and debt ceiling, but the issue of the IRS, your agency came up, and firearms, and the idea that in some of your job listings, I don't know if it's all of them, but it says that people who are looking to be employed should be willing to use deadly force. There was an article in the New York Post that was cited in this hearing that stated that the IRS had almost 5,000 guns, 3,282 handguns, 600 plus shotguns, 539 rifles, 15 fully automatic weapons. Anyway, big cache of weapons. Is that true or not true? With no sort of commentary on or a value judgment, is it true?
I'm not going to make a value judgment. I'm just going to make sure that I point out that our criminal investigation division is where we work to reduce and engage in tax fraud and acute areas of tax evasion, where in order to enforce, we're putting federal employees' life in danger, and therefore there's a need to arm. This is less than 3% of the IRS. It's a small part of the overall operation.
But just can you confirm that some number?
I can get back to you. I don't know the specifics on the data that you provide, but I certainly can get back. But I think context is important.
Well, I know my time has expired, and I regret that I didn't get to talk about the customer service challenges that you face. We can talk about that offline, but I've got real concerns like my colleagues do on that front. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, could you make sure that at some point you get us the total number of employees that are armed at the IRS? You said less than 3%, but...
Less than 3%. I can do that.
I would love to get the total
Mr. Chairman,
number
I will do that.
employees. Thank you. Ms. Del Bene, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for taking the time to be with us today. Appreciate it. Along with my colleagues, Mr. Pascal and Ms. Chu, I've led an appropriations letter requesting increased funding for the IRS. After years of neglect through decreased appropriations, the IRS has reduced workforce and staff to levels not seen since the 1970s. So the reduction in workforce has had a direct impact on taxpayer services, as folks have talked about. And with the funding provided by the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS can be brought into the 21st century and provide taxpayers with the customer service and transparency they deserve. I'm disheartened that funding for the very agency that's responsible for generating 96% of the funds that support the federal government's operations, including infrastructure and education, has become such a partisan issue. So, Commissioner, I wondered if you could speak to why annual discretionary funding for the IRS is still necessary and how the Inflation Reduction Act funding will supplement it.
I really appreciate the question. We've been saying I have a hard job to do, and one of the hardest jobs is to explain the funding that we need and why it's so important. And our base budget, which is currently at roughly $12 billion, that pays for ongoing operations, answering the phones, processing the returns that are coming in. And as you mentioned, what happened over the last 10 or 15 years is our population grew, filing went up, the economy grew, filings got more complicated, and our staff went down to about 1970s level. And so we really couldn't keep pace. So we have to build back to where we can meet that demand. I gave the analogy earlier of people waiting on the train platform, and if you don't fund our base budget, they wait longer and the platform gets more and more crowded. And what we're trying to put in our budget is here's what it takes to make sure that people aren't waiting too long on the platform and that it doesn't get too crowded. That's what it takes just to run the train schedules. But we need to modernize because right now, the system that we have is outdated. And when taxpayers go to their favorite airline or their favorite local bank, they engage and see a suite of tools on the call center, on the website, on their smartphones that they don't get from the IRS. And why? Because in the funding cuts that we've had over the past 10 or 15 years, we haven't had the ability to modernize. We've just kind of kept everything together, and we know that during COVID, we were no longer to keep it together as well as we could, and the bottom dropped out, and we went to historic low levels of service and historic long wait times. One concern I want to make sure is clear, and especially since it's been raised how important our taxpayer service investments are. Because our base budget has not been increased, in order to keep those trains going this year, we had to use Inflation Reduction Act service money to pay just for base operations. So essentially, we raided modernization dollars so that we could answer the phones. And by doing that, we now have less resources to modernize the phone system. It's the difference of, can the IRS answer the phone? Yes. Can the IRS modernize the phone system to improve the callback option, to produce, increase automated options? No, not if we raid to pay for base. And that's why it's important that Congress fund both our base and our modernization, because it's the American people that end up suffering. They're the ones waiting on that train platform for the next train to come that's taking too long and it's getting really crowded. And what we're doing in our budget is explaining what we need to do to keep those trains running and what we need to do to give them an experience commensurate with what they get around the block when they go to their local bank.
And it will just get harder the longer we wait to
Yes,
address
because
this.
it's getting more complicated. When I say 390,000 wealthy filers, that number's from 2019. It's probably a lot higher than that now. We're just catching up with the data.
I also wonder if you could speak to how the enforcement funding in the Inflation Reduction Act would improve taxpayer compliance and would close the tax gap, and what the revenue impacts of that might be.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier, when you think about the train platform, you think about service, but there's also an enforcement component there as well. And our audit rates of our most wealthy filers, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about the 400,000 level. I thought it might be helpful to explain to the American people, let's lift that up. Let's lift it up to individuals that make 10 million or more, partnerships and S-corps that have 10 million or more assets, corporations that have 250 million or more assets. So this is the wealthiest of the US filers, right? That is where we have 2,600 staff today with the right skill set and the right responsibilities to assess those 390,000 filers. And I know it sounds weird for the IRS to say it, but we're overmatched in that moment because we don't have enough people with the right skill sets to assess these filers. And if you're middle income, low income, own a mom and pop, we want to build your trust. We want to improve your service, but I don't know that we can effectively build your trust if we have the capacity to audit you, but don't have the capacity to audit the most wealthy filers because those filings are most complex. I would also share and reiterate my message to those mom and pops. There is no new wave of new audits coming. We are focused on building that capacity for the most wealthy filers. That is the directive from Secretary Yellen, and I'm going to meet it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Werfel, thank you for being here. You got a tough job, so we appreciate your service. The IRS gets a lot of scrutiny, but it should, because it's the one agency that touches literally every single American. It's really a question of, and we all understand it's important to collect revenue. The question is how to best do it in the fairest, most efficient way and the most just way possible. And it really comes down to an allocation of resources. You're hearing a lot about this 87,000 IRS personnel. It's not agents, as you pointed out, it's personnel. But with the addition of 87,000 additional personnel, the IRS will now be larger than the entire State Department, entire Border Patrol, entire Pentagon, and the entire FBI, not individually, but combined. First of all, my first question is, do you accept that metric as a fact?
I'm going to be providing an update with the staffing numbers over the 10-year period, but I'm willing to accept the premise that the IRS will grow and be larger than those agencies. My response to that is that that's the size of the organization needed to address the complexity of our tax system today.
So you do accept it, and it's just a question of math. There's
Well,
nothing really.
we'll have the next time I'm sitting here, we'll have all the numbers that we can look at. But I don't dispute the fact that under the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS will grow.
Do you believe that simplification of the tax code would reduce the number of needed IRS personnel?
Yes, I agree with that.
Do you think the tax code should be simpler?
As I said earlier, it's not my jurisdiction to weigh in on that. That is the domain of the Treasury Secretary on behalf of the administration. But I will say, the simpler the code, the more effective the IRS can be in administering.
And how is the decision made between CID agents, criminal investigative divisions, which is the law enforcement arm of the IRS, and non-law enforcement personnel? How is that allocation decision made? And how would you describe to the American people and to this committee who don't understand the difference, how would you describe that difference?
I mean, in virtually every interaction you're going to have with the IRS, it's not going to involve the criminal investigative division. If you're calling to get help, if you get a letter that's saying you missed filing, if you owe an amount, in virtually all cases, you're going to be dealing with an IRS employee that's not part of our criminal investigation division. What happens, though, is that certain tax issues become acute. They become more challenging. We've reached out. There's nefarious behavior. There's an unscrupulous actor. This unscrupulous actor is known to be dangerous. We work with local law enforcement. Right. We work with the Justice Department. This is all, and I would be happy to unpack this with you in a separate briefing.
You've answered sufficiently, but can you understand the concern? Because people, there have been abuses in the past, as there have been with other agencies, and I hope you're working to correct that. But just the allocation of resources, the State Department's required for diplomacy efforts across the globe. Border Patrol is responsible for protecting the entire southern border, 1,300 miles, and the entire northern border with Canada, from gun runners and drug runners, drug dealers, terrorists, CI concerns. The Pentagon is a nerve center of our entire United States military, and the FBI is responsible for counterintelligence, counterterrorism, criminal, and cybersecurity. Those are very broad, and it's encapsulating the size of all four of those agencies. So what would your response be? I mean, it's clearly you want as many people as you can to execute your mission. But for Americans who are concerned about
I want the right amount of people to execute our mission. I want to right-size the IRS. I mean, I've heard the phrase supersize the IRS. That is not the intent. We have to meet the demand. If there's a certain amount of calls coming in, we have to have the right amount of people on the phones. If there are people coming into our walk-in centers, they can't be closed. It's not fair to the taxpayers. The taxpayers don't have a choice. They have to pay their taxes. They have to work with the IRS. If we are ill-equipped to work with them, then we're not serving the American people.
But do you believe that demand is the case because of how complex the tax code is?
I think that's a big driver of it. Okay. It also is the number of filers that we have. We're a growing economy, a growing population, something we should be proud of. But with that comes a larger tax system.
I'm glad we can agree on one thing. The tax code needs to be simplified because it's tens of thousands of pages of a monstrosity that you need a sophisticated tax attorney to navigate. So with that, sir, I appreciate your service.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Stubbe is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On March 9th, 2023, the IRS sent agents to the home of Twitter Files journalist Matt Taibbi during his testimony in front of the House Select Committee on Weaponization of the Federal Government. IRS agents don't generally just show up at taxpayer homes, making the situation even more bizarre. The agents left a note telling Mr. Taibbi to call them. If this was an issue that could be handled with a phone call, there would seem to be no reason to send the agents in person. The presumption has to be that this was an attempt to intimidate a witness unless it can be proven otherwise. I mean, this is the type of tactics you see in Soviet or communist China. Are you willing to state that there is an appearance of impropriety when an executive branch agent shows up at the home of a witness testifying before Congress, literally at the time while he's testifying before a committee?
Congressman, Section 6103 prohibits me from responding to specific questions to an incident involving a taxpayer.
Okay, well, did you approve of the visit to Mr. Taibbi's home?
Again, same.
Who would approve that? What would be the approval process?
Again, I would be breaking the law if I asked a question specific to a specific incident of a taxpayer.
Okay, well, let me ask you this way. Is there any incidences with any taxpayer that you would have to approve the involvement of? Either an agent going to their house or approval of an investigation?
As a general rule, the IRS commissioner is not involved.
So who would be, as a general rule?
As a general rule, we have IRS personnel that work to ensure that individuals are complying with the tax code. So, for example, if they don't file, we will send a letter. If they owe a debt, we will reach out with a letter. I think it's important to understand it, a very broad sense, without commenting on any specific taxpayer. The IRS reaches out in multiple ways to educate taxpayers while ensuring it fairly enforces our taxes.
Well, obviously, there's got to be some type of approval process for investigations, right? So, like, whether it's Mr. Taibbi or whoever, what is that process within the IRS? And are there instances, depending on the profile of the taxpayer, that you would be involved? And if you would not be involved, who is the approval process for opening an investigation, going to an individual's home? How does that work?
Okay, again, making sure that I'm careful.
I'm speaking completely generally here.
Yeah. Well, I think I would like the opportunity to get back to you on the specifics.
So you can't, as you sit here right now, tell me how the approval process works for opening an investigation on a taxpayer, going to their home, an agent showing up at their home, any of that. You can't give me any specifics on that.
I will offer, as a general matter, one important clarifying point to your questions, which is any home visit that occurs is typically after the taxpayer has been contacted through a letter or some less invasive method, and we were not able to contact the taxpayer in that way. As a very general matter, I can share that with you. But in terms of your question of the complete process of an investigation being opened at the IRS to closure, I'm not prepared to provide you an answer with full fidelity because I'm still learning the process, and I will get back to you.
Okay, so you said generally that if somebody's showing up to somebody's house, it's obviously been elevated. So would that be a criminal investigation?
I did not say it was elevated. I said that we would.
You said you would have opened an investigation, right?
No, I did not say that. I said that we would typically try to reach a taxpayer through a letter before we would do any kind of additional outreach. And if we failed to hear back from that taxpayer, then going to someone's home is a possibility.
So would that be a criminal investigator within the department that would go there, or a non-criminal investigator?
As a general matter, it would often be a non-criminal investigator.
The House Oversight Committee has discovered numerous LLCs affiliated with Hunter Biden, where it appears he was laundering money through the LLCs and paying for basic living expenses out of the LLCs. Now, I know you can't speak to specific taxpayers, so I'm not going to ask you that question, but if the House Oversight Committee has evidence of a crime that was committed or what appears to be tax fraud or tax evasion, who would they get those documents to within your department? Is that something that we should get directly to you?
No, again, the IRS commissioner would not be involved. When there is and again, not specific to any specific taxpayer, but when there is an allegation of any kind, particularly from a whistleblower or anything like that.
Or evidence deduced from a oversight committee in Congress?
Exactly.
So
who
would it be within your
Inspector
department that would handle that investigation?
The Inspector General.
Within IRS?
Yes.
What is
well, he doesn't. It's the Tax Inspector General. It's the Inspector General for Tax Administration, Russell George. And anytime I learn of an allegation, a credible allegation that something isn't right, I immediately refer it to the Inspector General to do the investigation. And as I said, then I stand back, let the Inspector General do their work, and my one ask of the Inspector General is, let me know how I can help, and I wait to hear back from him.
So I'm just trying to wrap this around so I fully understand.
Yes.
So you, as the commissioner, are not involved in making any of those decisions. So regardless of who it is, again, I'm not asking a taxpayer, at no point in time do you get involved in making investigative decisions,
correct,
enforcement decisions,
correct,
and your testimony here today is that's the IG and only the IG.
For when there's an allegation of wrongdoing amongst an IRS employee, or an allegation that requires additional investigation, but I think we might be talking past each other. If there is,
I'm not talking about internally. I'm talking about a taxpayer.
We need to wrap it up.
Okay. I think we should take this offline, but again, I will go back to the important point. The IRS commissioner does not generally engage in decisions about individual taxpayers. If there is an allegation that something is not right with respect to IRS operations, the Inspector General investigates it. If it just involves a taxpayer and they're being investigated for tax evasion, that decision is made not at the commissioner level, but at the bureau level within the IRS.
I yield back. My time's expired.
Mrs. Chu is recognized.
Commissioner Werfel, I want to congratulate you and every IRS employee on what was, by all accounts, a tremendously successful filing season. The IRS hit an 87% level of service, which is 5 times higher than last year, hired 5,000 new customer service representatives, assisted 100,000 more taxpayers in person, and cut the phone call wait time from 28 minutes to just 3 minutes. The reason for this incredible turnaround is clear. Democrats, led by this committee, finally gave the IRS the resources it needed to operate properly. The Inflation Reduction Act reversed over a decade of intentional disinvestment in the agency, and I was proud to play a part in its passage. Contrary to the misinformation we've heard from the other side of the aisle, the IRA is improving taxpayer service and improving tax compliance by the wealthy. It's not targeting low-income taxpayers. And in fact, actually, I've been long concerned about the unfair burden of enforcement that low-income taxpayers shouldered in recent years. It was back in 2022 that I asked numerous times in hearings with our IRS commissioner about the data that showed that low-income filers earning less than $25,000 had been audited as much as 5 times higher than the other filers, and these were the EITC filers. And so, Commissioner, could you describe how the IRA funding has impacted IRS's ability to ensure that both the wealthy taxpayers are obeying the law and that low-income filers are not unfairly targeted?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. And the critical thing that the Inflation Reduction Act provides the IRS that we haven't had previously is the resources to build capacity to assess complicated returns of high-income filers. You know, I've talked earlier in the hearing about our coverage or our audit rate for organizations that make more or have more than 100 million in assets, and it is historically low today. And that's because, as you described, there's been an era of divestment in IRS resources. The Inflation Reduction Act allows us to essentially stop that reduction and start to build a capacity that existed previously. And we have a lot of catching up to do because the world is very different right now in terms of the complexity of these organizations. Partnerships are more complex than they were 10 years ago. Multinational corporations are more complex. And I believe even the way that billionaires operate their finances change. As an example, cryptocurrency didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. So we have an ever-complicating environment by which to enforce the code. And a lot of these complications don't impact middle and low income. Most middle and low income are single source income, paying their taxes essentially through their payroll. A lot of these changes really only impact the wealthiest Americans. And if the IRS is unable to develop a capacity to keep up with that, well, that means that we're not doing our job to fairly enforce the tax code so that you are just as likely to be assessed of meeting your commitment if you're lower middle income as you are higher income, and that doesn't exist today. And I think what you're describing is there's an opportunity because of the Inflation Reduction Act to create more fairness in the system that will build trust. And ultimately, I do think that's my bottom line as commissioner, is to build trust with the American people that we're meeting our mission effectively.
Thank you so much. Commissioner, as a member representing a district with a high percentage of people that speak other languages, I'm very thankful of the efforts the IRS is making to meet the needs of taxpayers with limited English proficiency. I see that these efforts are mentioned as a goal in the Inflation Reduction Act. But what specifically are you going to be doing to help these taxpayers with that limited English proficiency?
There is a section in our strategic operating plan that points to efforts under the Inflation Reduction Act to improve the way we serve underserved populations. service improvements across diverse taxpayer segments, including those with limited English proficiency. That means digital tools accessible in taxpayers' preferred languages. Again, we have now the investments to do that. We have funds and resources now to expand community partnerships, to engage with taxpayers, to understand how to educate and meet people where they are. Again, this is the type of unlock that the Inflation Reduction Act provides. I said earlier, it's the difference between just being able to answer the phone versus being able to provide a callback option. Well, it's more than just a callback option. It's the difference between just standing back and waiting for the taxpayer to come and being only able to serve them in one language versus meeting the taxpayers where they are, understanding what their needs are to comply with the tax code, and meeting them where they are.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Tinney is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. And thank you to our witness. And I know you have a tough job. I used to do tax law. I know how difficult it can be and how scary it is, actually, for consumers, small businesses, and those. And I appreciate your comments today, understanding that as well. I think a lot of what the concern is, and a lot of consumers and taxpayers see the IRS as all-powerful, trying to be too intrusive, trying to be too controlling, interfering in our lives, now going online to not only be the tax collector, but the tax preparer. And, the $600 transactions that I might, buy something from my sister and I've got to report that for $600, or whatever. I think people are concerned about that. And they're concerned about our system of justice. And that's why I think you see so many questions surrounding power in this case. And I've always looked at the IRS as very all-powerful. It's, the core principles of our system is you are innocent until proven guilty. It seems the IRS operates on the opposite principle. You're guilty until proven innocent. And I think that's a lot of the presumption that people feel sensitive about it. And I know that you had an extensive dialogue with my colleague, Mr. Stubbe, on the situation with Matt Taibbi and a lot of the eyebrows that raised, that all of a sudden here he is testifying on a sensitive issue dealing with the administration, and suddenly he has an IRS agent at his door. And I understand you can't talk about that, but I know there were a couple of issues surrounding that, and one of those is that Chairman Jim Jordan actually asked you about providing some of the requested documents to Chairman Jordan. Did you in fact provide those documents that were requested by Jim Jordan?
I need to check, and I'm not sure I can answer that question in this setting.
Well, let me ask you. This is a document request, response, and answer. So you should be able to answer that question.
I apologize, Congresswoman. It's my understanding that if I answered that question, it's a violation of 6103. If I'm wrong about that, I will make a correction.
Let me ask this: is that document request going to be granted, whether it has been done or not?
Well, let me lift up and say it is my absolute commitment to comply with all document requests from this committee, from Congressman Jordan's committee. I welcome the oversight. I really do. I think it's important to be able to answer the tough questions. That's how we build trust. And Congressman Tenney, you said it, there's this power dynamic. And one of the ways we can reduce that power dynamic is making sure that we're complying with oversight entity requests, and that is my commitment.
Right, and I appreciate you're sensitive to that issue as well, but let me ask you this, and was the IRS agent that showed up at Mr. Taibbi's door armed with a weapon?
Again, another question that I can't answer because it involves an individual.
Well, let me ask you on the technical side of that, since we'll get into procedure, let's take Mr. Taibbi out of that. Assuming, what is the standard for somebody that has an IRS agent show up at their door? What is the standard for showing up armed? I mean, obviously we know that we have a drug dealer that's not, for example, paying their taxes, but if we have a journalist who probably isn't making a whole lot of money, I mean, it just concerns me that standard is something that really we should look into as the IRS. I mean, it's not every day that an IRS agent shows up at your door with weapons. So I think that should be more rare than the rule. So let me just go back, and I want to get to another substantive question. I just wanted to talk to you, if we could, a little bit about applying the R&D credit, or the R&E credit as it's known under 26 U.S. Code Section 41. There's been a lot of inconsistencies expressed to me in my district through my tours through businesses and really having a legacy of a lot of small business, a lot of innovation, a lot of technology. There's been a lot of confusion about, inconsistency in enforcing that R&D rule and, and a lack of clarity. And there was a question raised in last term about getting some guidance on that. And I just want to say it was not provided. And I just want to, for the record, Mr. Chairman, I want to actually put into the record 2 general guidance documents, one on architects and whether they qualify, and one on engineers and whether they qualify, that we obtained on the IRS's view of that. So I want to, for the record, if the chairman would accept these.
So ordered.
Thank you. I just want to also, so where are we going with this R&D credit? I mean, we're in a situation, we have the IRA passed, we have all these tax credits we want to see innovation, we want to see our supply chains come back, we want to get ourselves in a better situation against some of our competitors and adversaries like China on innovation. Shouldn't we really look into this R&D credit and make it consistent and fair for taxpayers? Because that's really all many taxpayers ask. Many people are willing to pay their taxes. They just want consistency, fairness, neutrality in their IRS regulations, so that we can have a fair playing field, especially for our innovators in our communities. Would you agree with that assessment?
I agree. And, as you were talking earlier, Congresswoman, about the power dynamic, I reached for, some people carry around the Constitution of the United States, and I certainly respect them doing that. I carry around the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and I make sure that I'm reminded of what my responsibility is as the IRS Commissioner to make sure that we're protecting those rights. And a lot of those rights deal with things like the right to know what you owe and what you're entitled to. And so your point.
Well, no, and if I could just, I know I don't have any time left, but I have worked a lot with a lot of tax preparers, and we have to come up with the laws to make it easier for you and for us to collect the taxes that are properly due, and also to give rights to our citizens. And I have a longtime tax preparer. It was one of my mentors who said, here's how we should look at our tax preparation: simplicity, transparency, stability, and neutrality. That's how we make tax law. Agreed. And I think that's something that the IRS and you as the new commissioner would be grateful if you could look up and make that kind of policy based on those rules of the road, which are so simple and really what we're all looking for fairness. So
we got to wrap it up.
I know my time is up, and I thank you so much for your service. I appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to be very specific on the time frames, because it's been 2 members that's went over 1 minute and 30 seconds just in the last 3 times. So I will cut you off much quicker. Ms. Fischbach, please.
And Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and I take that very seriously. And I will say a lot of the questions that I had were, we've been discussing already, but so I have just a couple of follow-up things. Dr. Murphy had asked about how many people you think, I don't know if he used the word cheated or on their taxes. You came up with about 85%. You said 85%, if you're recalling that.
Yeah, I'd like to confirm that number. I'm not sure I understand the question in terms of cheated. That's not a technical definition. I can certainly come back to this committee with a very precise detail in terms of where the different categories of noncompliance sit.
Okay, and I appreciate that, because that was going to be kind of my question. When you came up with that number, and maybe this will help with your follow-up, I'm wondering what percentage of that would you consider, or what part of that would you consider actual cheaters? I mean, who intentionally write something wrong or deceptive on their taxes, and how many of those people don't understand the complicated tax code that we have in place, and that leads so for your follow-up, please, because I would like to see that. I would like to understand that.
I'm glad you provided me the opportunity to clarify.
And in particular, maybe even the breakdown with those poor middle-class folks that are doing their own taxes and trying to figure out what's going on, and it leads into kind of a follow-up that I had. You said you're doing more audits on the middle class because the wealthier have more complicated, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I've been hearing. The wealthier have more complicated returns, and it's more difficult, more time consuming to do those. And I'm wondering, if that's the case, why are we looking at quantity versus quality instead of moving resources and focusing on potentially some of those folks? But it seems like you're just saying, oh, well, there's more of them, so we do it. instead of actually moving resources and focusing on some of those that potentially have more complicated returns?
Well, first of all, I want to make a clarification. The audit rates are going down for middle income as well, and I mean that's one of the issues that I raised earlier. That as example, the latest rate we have, 2018, is a historically low rate, and that's
okay. But and I am reclaiming my time since the
sorry.
since the chair just gave me the warning. But you know. Kind of.
The answer to your question is yes. We are moving resources in a way to go after the more complicated returns that are going to have the highest return on investment. That's the goal.
Okay, because it really felt like, you know, is there kind of a quantity kind of focus? Because obviously, with one guy, you can do more for the more on the middle class than the more complicated returns. But I guess, and you know what I'm going to do is, given that, since you're going to follow up on the 85%, I got 1 minute and 51 seconds left, and I am going to yield back.
Wow.
I just made points with the chair.
You definitely have some gold stars. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized.
I'll try to do the same. Mr. Commissioner, you did in your opening testimony talk about how the added resources that were given in the Inflation Reduction Act did bring up the number of calls that were answered, the number of audits that were resolved. And so, but I also heard you say that more complicated tax returns are challenging for the IRS. And I can tell you that my district in Alabama, in the Black Belt, is one of the largest districts that has that gets the earned income tax credit audit. These are working Americans who make less than minimum wage sometimes. And the fact that 20 to 30% of those audits are in poor, vulnerable communities, seems to me you should be using those resources to go after, I mean, what you're getting, what the federal government gets by auditing them, while it makes a big difference to those families, is peanuts in the grand scheme of things. So can you talk to us about why that is and what you're doing about it?
It's a really important question, Congresswoman, because, you know, I think what happened, for example, with the Earned Income Tax Credit, just to go back in history a little bit, is that program, because of the improper payments law that is on the books, that program has a historically high improper payment, and so as part of IRS historical remediation of those improper payments, audits increase.
I hear you.
I'm not defending it or not.
I know,
I'm just giving you the historic.
But, you know, ProPublica did a survey. I mean, this is documented.
Yeah.
And that in the report shows, the study found that EITC audits are mostly heavily concentrated in the South and in Southern Black Belt, and I represent them. Greene County, where the median income for a family there is right around $20,000, $20,000 for four, was among the 10 most audited counties in the country for EITC recipients. In fact, audit rates in many of these areas are more than 40%, I gave them 40% higher than the national average, hitting rural communities of color the hardest.
Yeah.
We gave you some money, gave you a lot of money actually. I don't expect you to target poor people. So I understand that there's a problem that needs to be in the policy of ITC, then we should do something about that. But if you think that there's a reason, I don't know what to ask you other than to say, please do something about that.
Yeah. My response to you, Congresswoman, would be first, I absolutely am in the firm belief that fairness and equity in our tax system is essential. You're asking important questions. We are looking and studying and assessing the potential for that our EITC audit program is not consistent with these values of fairness. And I'm going to have to report back to you on what we find and work together to make sure that it is fair. I mean, we are on a journey to get to more fairness. And I think identification of the issue is maybe even not half the battle, but an important part of the battle. Now the battle begins. And I will work with you on this. That's my commitment.
I look forward to that. I yield back the balance of my time, 55 seconds.
Thank you, Representative. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioner. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your willingness to take on this role. I want to raise a few concerns I've heard from constituents regarding the processing, IRS processing of the Employee Retention Tax Credit, the ERTC. And I do understand the program was implemented quickly, and you know the IRS had to learn to run it as it was being developed almost. You know, so I know there were kinks that needed to be ironed out, but we're now 3 years out from enactment, and I'm still hearing from employers who've had challenges receiving the funds. Some may still be waiting, and in some cases even had to shut down the business completely because they did not receive the funds that were promised, the relief. The program appears to be rife with inconsistencies, and I just want to raise this hoping for maybe your feedback, and hopefully you're planning to make some program improvements. So for one example, an employee shared with me that they had received their Q2 and Q4 refunds 20 weeks after applying, but never got the Q3. The IRS somehow determined they were ineligible for the payment for Q3, although they got 2 and 4, because they considered the employer a government entity. After successfully appealing, that employer finally received the Q3 check a year later. And I asked a tax preparer how that could happen, and they revealed that they must send in the 941X form separately for each quarter, or else do not get scanned into the system. So it seems like there's a problem there. They were also told that initially, they were not told that initially, so many sent in their claims forms for the year, which delayed refund checks. Another employer received a refund check, but then shortly after was contacted by the IRS being told to return the funds. In the weeks this employer spent trying to get clarification, he received another check. So it's actually sort of frightening for employers when they're trying to do the right thing and they're getting a lot of mixed messages and a lot of different results. Another conversation with tax preparers, they shared that they were not informed when the IRS removed the Kansas City Processing Center from ERTC processing. So I understand that you may be redeploying agents to help process the backlog of these claims, but I'd like to understand what is being done to expedite the unprocessed backlog at the Kansas City facility or anywhere else.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Congressman. And you know, lifting up before I get into the ERC, like we are getting healthier. We are in the process of getting healthier, and I think our low point was during COVID, after years of funding decrease, and then having to shut down our operations and then retool our operations into a virtual environment. We lost a lot of ground. The paper piled up, including new requirements, such as the employee retention credit, such as economic impact payments. So it was a bit of a perfect.
So are all these cases being processed now? And I'm sorry to
Yes,
cut
they
you
are.
off, but
They are being processed now, as I mentioned
so
earlier.
none being held back. Like at this point,
no.
we can be
The only
assured-
reason why it would be on hold is if we thought there was an issue of fraud or error. Otherwise, it's being processed. Where we were up to 20K a week at the end of filing season in terms of the number we're processing.
Thank you. And the issue of all of the 941s being in one envelope, can you commit that the individuals processing these will process multiple forms in the
Let me
same
look
envelope?
into that and commit to get back to you on that question.
All right, thank you. And just, I have a minute left. You've talked a lot about the $80 billion. You continue describing the hiring at the IRS and the new funding as merely right-sizing the agency, and you even push back today on the argument that the funding is supersizing the agency.
Yes.
I do want to point out, and I'd like to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, if I may, an article from the New York Times from April 27th, 2021. And in this article, former IRS Commissioner Koskinen, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, said that he thought, and this is a quote, the $80 billion being proposed by the Biden administration might be too much. And his quote in the interview was, "I'm not sure you'd be able to efficiently use that much money. That's a lot of money." So again, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm almost out of time, but I'd like to submit that for the record if I could. Thank you.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. We're getting down to the point where it gets to serious business. Everybody's left for votes.
Let's get down to
There's
business.
just a few people left on the dais. This is where we get the real work done. I'm going to ask us to actually suspend reality for a minute and talk as if we weren't in a congressional hearing, say in a client-consultant type of relationship. And as I look at this whole, and I represent Ogden, Utah, which is an amazing processing center, thousands of employees, my constituents. And so I have taken this issue to heart to really dig into and truly understand, what we need to be doing here. And what I want to highlight is there is area of consensus here. My frustration comes with how this all came out. This was, for better or worse, usually for worse, when one party rule in Washington, they always, you have to do big things and, you try to get as much through legislation as you can. And there was a big bill that cost a lot of money last year in the Inflation Reduction Act. And in order to get that accomplished, we needed to find, the Democrat Party needed to find revenue. So they did a huge IRS bill because the CBO would score it so they could gain revenue over time. Of course we're going to be frustrated at that. We don't want to manipulate a government agency in that way to be able to just satisfy a CBO score. So all that aside, setting that context, we've got real areas of consensus here. And as I go meet with my constituents in Ogden, and as I hear and address this issue, there is a lot of opportunity for technical modernization, customer service capabilities to enhance that. And my point is, if I was consulting the IRS and say, let's take this as a huge win, and there's areas of consensus, let's dig in and really go out and find that opportunity. The workforce that you have is strapped. They don't have the tools they need to do their job. So before we go and add on an enormous amount of individuals and workforce to an already sort of system that doesn't work for them currently, let's shore that up. And then after we evaluate the improvements that we've made in this tech modernization, in customer service capabilities, in a toll-free number automation opportunity for them to not have to be so bogged down with phone calls that they can't answer, why don't we try that? And then ultimately take another look and say, this is where the workforce needs to go. I would love your just sincere response to that. Is that something that if we were to be serious adults back here, instead of any of the partisan back and forth, could we actually get something done if we did that?
If I understand correctly, I think your question resonates completely with me. Thinking about the folks in Ogden, and I really appreciate you calling them out for the amazing civil servants that they are. And going back to this question of what kind of IRS are we going to be? Are we going to be an IRS that just can answer the phones? Or are we going to be an IRS that actually enhances and modernizes? And let me give a good example. With respect to the employee retention credits that those folks in Ogden are working really hard to process right now, currently the IRS does not have the capability to ingest an amended return electronically. We need to be able to advance our technology to be able to do that. Now you can say, well, that's outrageous. Why don't they have that capability? And we can relitigate it from the past. And I can make the case that resources have been dwindling for years and years, and that's why we haven't done it. And someone might make another case, I don't know. But to your point, can we roll up our sleeves and figure out what do we need in Ogden, Utah to improve that operation? Because ultimately it's going to help the employees, but more importantly, and I think the employees would agree, it helps the taxpayers. People are waiting for their retention credits. I don't want them waiting for their retention credits. I want them to get their retention credits as quickly as possible. And but these types of gaps are what we're dealing with.
And these types of gaps, this is the part that, and if I haven't seen it, if I haven't done enough research, I apologize in advance, but from the IRS plan and from GAO reports, or the plan that was released in early April, technology, the word technology was referred to many times, but I haven't seen the specificity on what is needed. Because I know there's a motivation on our side, because our offices are getting bogged down with requests, and we can't even help our constituents to the extent that we need. Like, we would love to see the specificity laid out, knowing that I'm sick and tired of saying there needs tech modernization. If I say that one more time without real 7 layers of additional things, specifics that we need to do for these folks, like, that's the area that I want to get to. So I will add my comments from a gentleman from my colleague from Arizona. Like, I'm ready to roll up my sleeves too and dig in and actually get this part done before we add on thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of more employees to a system that doesn't work currently. Let's fix that and then figure out where we need to go future. And I definitely am going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you for staying on schedule. The chair now recognizes Mr. Byer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. Commissioner Werfel, I just want to thank you for being here and taking on this task of leading the IRS through a very pivotal time. And I represent many, many IRS employees, and I know they're thrilled to see that with your leadership through the Inflation Reduction Act, we're finally providing the employees with the resources they need to serve the American people better. I just want to say, too, that, I don't know, maybe we're lucky, but our taxpayer advocates have been terrific and done a really, really good job.
Thank you for that feedback.
However, we do still get a lot of incoming requests, which we're able to fix. Can you tell us about how the backlog is? We're not that many months away from those huge Washington Post, New York Times stories of cafeterias filled with unprocessed IRS returns.
So, look, I said earlier to an earlier question, we are in the process of getting healthy, right? Coming into this, from last filing season, 22, into this filing season, we cut our backlog in half. We did that and people working hard, some of the people that you represent, overtime, you know, anytime they're not doing something, they're working the paper backlog. But we also scanned more. And this is part of a modern IRS. And, you know, we were not doing enough before we had the funds in the Inflation Reduction Act to avail ourselves of the sophisticated technology that's out there to take a tax return and convert it to machine-readable format, a paper return. A lot of the backlog, most of the backlog, if not all, is caused by paper. And the fact that we don't have an automated way of processing it, so you have individuals keying it in, which seems like decades-old technology, and that's what it is. But because we're now adding a scanning technology that we previously didn't have the resources to avail ourselves of, we now have a more sophisticated technology on the ground, turning forms into machine-readable so they can be ingested into IRS systems. That's an example of what we're doing. Between this filing season and next filing season, it is an absolute priority to further make an enormous dent in our paper backlog, and I'm hoping that citizens start to see the results of that.
Great, thank you. I also want to thank you on the tax gap, the unfairness of having the rich pay by one set of rules and working families pay by another is pernicious and dangerous, and it really undermines the basic social contract that's kept our country so strong. So thank you for that. I want to touch on something I don't think anyone's mentioned yet. I was ambassador to Switzerland for 4 years, an incredible privilege. And one of the biggest problems we had was Americans paying their taxes, the American expats. And the challenge was that so many of them didn't owe any taxes to the United States, but still had to pay $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 in CPA fees to get the tax returns processed over here. I know you have a new initiative right now on allowing them to pay with their foreign bank accounts. Can you update us on what you're trying to do to make Americans' tax compliance, the 3 to 6 million Americans who live overseas, a lot easier than what it is right now?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked this, Congressman, because it goes back to this broader theme of we have to meet taxpayers where they are. Some of them are overseas, some of them are in rural communities, some of them don't have the means to hire an accountant or pay for a third-party provider. And some of them are hiring an army of accountants. And for those taxpayers that are international, that want to meet their obligations, even though they're expatriates, which is great, and that's what we would expect, we need to work with them to figure out how to make their filing easier as well. And to the extent that they're paying CPAs for filing with no balance due, we want to work to fix that.
Great. We have legislation which you can't comment on, but bipartisan, which we will bring before you. And one last thing in my last minute. By a 217 to 215 vote, the Republicans passed their bill yesterday, What would happen if we actually took away that $80 billion?
Yeah, I'm trying, Congressman, to explain in the plainest possible language how devastating that would be for the American people, not just for the IRS. Because again, we are not resourced to meet the demand that is created by the complexity of our tax system today. That complexity is in part the code, but it's in part just the number of filers, the population. And I keep on going back to this analogy of the train platform. Right now, because of the IRA, we can get those trains moving. We can move people off the platform, get them where they want to go. If you repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, you eviscerate our ability to fix the problems that we've had historically. Those train platforms will get more and more crowded. The trains won't come. Americans will be frustrated. They'll be calling your offices. They'll be saying, I'm a terrible person. That's okay. But the important point is that eliminating the Inflation Reduction Act actually harms taxpayers.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I would first like to, let me start by saying that the taxpayer advocates in New York City, we'll start on a positive note, they've done a great job.
Great.
With my office. We've spoken with them. They've been very helpful. 528 constituent cases that my office has had to intervene in, which is the negative part. The fact that these American tax-paying citizens need to contact their member of Congress to get a solution or a resolution. So I would ask one question. Are your staff members still working from home? You still have that COVID telework, or are they all back in the office today?
It is a mix like all other federal agencies. I would emphasize that everyone's working. I will say that in my first few weeks at the IRS, the question that I've focused on with the IRS right now is, are we getting the job done? Are we answering the phones? Are we fighting off cyber attacks? Are we processing the backlog? As long as the answer to that question is yes, then that's going to be my priority. Now, if the answer is no, then I want to go deeper into the issue and figure out what the issue is. And if the issue happens to be the telework policy is negatively impacting our ability to get the job done for the American people, then we will make a change.
Well, I would love to suggest that it's time to bring everyone back to the workplace. As you know, Republicans passed a bill to get all federal employees, half the workforce, still working from home. And I think that does have an issue to do with constituent services and making sure that these calls are answered. The fact that one congressional office in just 2 years had to intervene in over 500 cases is a problem. When we were in our hearing in Peachtree, Georgia, one of the accountants who testified said that she had been transferred 4 times and was placed on hold for 3 hours until she received assistance. I want to also move on to another major issue that I'm seeing with my constituents. Sadly, we have had over a dozen issues of check thefts, check fraud, either stimulus checks or tax refunds that have been stolen. Someone had signed the checks and deposited the money. Are you aware of this happening, and are you working, what are you doing to try to resolve that issue? Are you working closely with the U.S. Postal Service and the Department of Justice to address that?
Yeah, I know another early priority of mine, Congresswoman, is to, in particular, address issues where there's a victim. Look, it's upsetting when someone doesn't pay their taxes because that victimizes the U.S. government's financial bottom line, and we're of course concerned about that. But when there's an individual victim, whether it's identity theft, their money is stolen, they're taken advantage of, that is something that we absolutely have to prioritize. So I absolutely commit to working with the Postal Service, the Justice Department on cracking down on that type of nefarious behavior.
I appreciate that, and I would also make the argument that that should really be a priority. I see some of the other initiatives that you're focusing on, whether it's the 1099s for selling something on eBay or whatnot, or going after these small just middle class people. I think what we should do is focus on these types of things to prevent those fraudsters. But in addition to that, you said earlier that you cannot meet the demands of today, and now we're also seeing that the IRS is interjecting itself in government-populated returns, trying to, we have a whole industry of tax preparers that are hundreds of thousands of jobs. good-paying jobs, that they do this in the private sector and they do it right. I think this is a case of government coming in saying that they feel they could do something better than the people who actually do it every day. And I would say if you can't meet demands of today, and we have a lot of backlog here, why interject yourself in doing something more? Why fix something that's not broken?
Well, two responses to that. First, Congress asked us to study it, so we're going to study it. And the second is any product that would go forward would be an option for taxpayers. They would not have to use it if they didn't want. And for me, the question is, are we offering the right set of services based on taxpayer preference? You know, whether they're overseas, whether they still need to file paper, whether they want to walk into our walk-in center. I think we have an obligation to be able to provide diverse enough services to meet taxpayer preferences. So once this study is done, we'll take a look at it, we'll talk with you about it and see if this makes sense to meet a taxpayer preference that's out there, if it's feasible and if the costs are right.
As you can imagine, for some of us, it's just looking like IRS looking to do more big government, more bureaucracy, and interjecting itself in an area where it really should just leave it to the private sector. But I would love to work with you to see how we can fix some of the issues that I brought up earlier today, because it truly is my constituents and other American citizens who are being victimized. Thank you very much for your time. I now recognize Ms. Steele of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Commissioner,
Thank you.
for participating today. This is such a long hours that you've been sitting and enduring, so thank you. And thank you for your service, too. Having said that, American families and small businesses are having a hard time trusting in the IRS. Our constituents should not have to fear that the IRS might come after them. Per previous data, TIGTA, Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, half of large corporate audits result no change. The article from this morning titled "The Surprising Risk in Ramping Up IRS Audits," according to that article, states that nearly half of those making $10 million or more who were audited saw no changes in their tax bills in 2018. 13% of audits of people making between $100,000 to $200,000 were no change audits in 2018, IRS data show. More than 1 in 4 people with income between $1 million and $5 million were given clear bills of health. And almost half of audits of corporations with at least $1 billion in assets found they owed nothing more. Why are so many Americans being audited for no reason? This article, that the surprising risk in ramping up IRS audits, saying that could be because of the IRS is picking the wrong people to audit, or it doesn't have the right specialist to go toe-to-toe with big law and accounting firms, though we are not really sure. So we all kind of like questioning that. Sounds like a problem is not needing more money or doing more audits, but one of wasted resources. Commissioner, how will you ensure that the correct people are getting audited in the first place?
Yeah, so the objective, Congresswoman, is equitable tax enforcement, right? We should be able to demonstrate to the American people that no matter what your means are and no matter how complicated your return is, the IRS is treating you the same. So just because your return is simpler to review doesn't mean you should be more likely to get an audit. If your return is more complicated to review, we should be equally equipped. And currently, we're not equally equipped. The reason, I believe, my hypothesis is the reason why you see zero balance due audits is because we don't have the right capacities today to unlock these complex returns in an effective way. And there isn't a lot of audit coverage. In fact, we are at historic low audits across the board, including for the wealthiest, most taxpayers.
So what you're saying is zero balances because of that didn't have enough sufficient enough.
We need the right economists, data scientists, attorneys. We need to tap into the people that know how these returns were constructed. The world is moving very quickly in terms of the complexity of these corporations.
But isn't the staff supposed to be trained for that?
We
Those
haven't had the
85,000
resources to train.
people? So you are not training your people for
Not as
years
effectively
now.
as we could. We haven't had the funds to train. We have a staffing level pre-Inflation Reduction Act that's equivalent to where we were in the 1970s. We have not had enough resources to meet the requirements of today's tax system. And with these resources and being able to train and hire the right mix of people, I anticipate that we will not have as many zero balance due audits in the future. And when we don't, it's going to be a tremendous return for the taxpayer. And that's why I think repealing the IRA costs so much in the eyes of the Congressional Budget Office. Because if the plan is to engage at that level, a 2%, a 3%, a 4% improvement in some of these metrics will easily pay for what the Inflation Reduction Act investment is.
Then why don't you just reduce the audits and just go really dig in those people that you are auditing instead of those 2%, 3%, and you don't have to increase those numbers on that?
It's a great question. I think, and it was another Congresswoman asked the question as well. I think we do have to optimize. It isn't about quantity. It isn't about doing more audits of wealthy taxpayers. It's doing the right audits and making sure that we have the right balance and the right optimized approach to how we examine the wealthiest taxpayers. We are not optimized right now. We are leaving money on the table.
Mr. Chairman, actually, I prepared 5 different questions, but it seems like my time is already up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it in writing and ask for these questions.
Perfect. Please submit your questions into writing, and
I would like that. Thank you.
we'll have that. Thank you, Representative. Ms. Moore is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our brand new IRS Commissioner, join my colleagues in thanking you for your patience. You're new, so I just am curious about your background. Were you hired from within IRS or you came from
No,
outside?
I started my career in government. I worked for many years at the Office of Management and Budget. I worked at the Justice Department, and
Okay,
I also worked at the IRS.
All right.
So I'm returning.
You're returning, okay.
Yes.
And I only asked that question so I can just get a baseline of what you know about the laws that we have passed recently. So in 2013, we reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act. And during that particular reauthorization, we required housing providers who had received the low-income housing tax credit funding to no longer evict victims as they had been doing along with their abusers. And so Treasury really has informally indicated that the agency does not see itself that they need to act because non-compliance with the Violence Against Women Act 2013 is not considered to be non-compliance under the statute that created the low-income housing tax credit. But the IRS is required to administer this. So are there any plans? Are there any priorities for it? Because, you know, women who are leaving abusive situations, that they are more in danger of losing their life at a time that they decide to leave a relationship. And so housing can be really critical in terms of their safety. Is this something that you're aware of, or is this a priority for you to
I was
implement?
recently made aware of it. I'm really glad you're asking the question. I understand that we are looking into the regulations and seeing whether they could be revised to expressly reference housing protections under the Violence Against Women Act. And I think that would potentially resolve the issue. It's really important that this committee raise these types of issues to our attention because that will allow me to prioritize and make sure that we close these types of issues that are problematic.
Well, I got some more for you,
Please.
Mr. Commissioner. The Earned Income Tax Credit. I just want to congratulate the IRS. They did a fantastic job during the pandemic, getting money out to people who otherwise would not have gotten it. The uptake in the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit is low, But through the non-filer portal, you were able to contact people who otherwise would not have received the benefit. We have been talking to Treasury about using that non-filer portal to identify people who could benefit from the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. Is that something that the IRS would be supportive of? These are really low income people, and they could benefit from this resource that is available and for which they're eligible.
Yeah, 100%. Look, when we implement something new, we learn a lot. When we, as the IRS, and this predates me, and I also congratulate the IRS workforce for the amazing work they did during the pandemic, we had to turn on a dime and implement these economic impact payments. In many cases, essentially life-saving payments for people in need.
Well, I just want to work with you to make sure that you actually implement, that you actually use that portal.
Yes,
it is so
I think it's a good
valuable
suggestion.
to do it. Implementation of the SAFER Act. Last Congress, as a part of Secure 2.0, there was a bill that Congresswoman McBath and our Congressman Schmucker from this committee and I all led, Saving Access for Escaping and Rebuilding Act, the SAFER Act. Again, domestic violence
Yes.
Often means that, women will not appropriately receive the tax refunds to which they may be entitled. And if the non-custodial parent files first, and then the custodial parent files second, there's a big hassle with straightening it out. They may have to file, a lot of paperwork. Is there any interest in helping victims of domestic violence? We saw this a lot during COVID. Those where, the non-custodial parent found themselves getting the check for the children and not sharing it with the actual custodial parent. And
It's a very
IRS felt
unfortunate
they could do
outcome.
nothing.
Yeah. It's a very unfortunate outcome, and I would absolutely be interested in making sure that the right parent gets the credit, and in particular, if the victim of domestic violence is not getting that credit when it's rightfully theirs, that is alarming and concerning, and I would like to work with you on that.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much, and I would yield back my time.
Ms. Van Dyne's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Finally. Mr. Werfel, you've been doing this for a really long time. You came in almost exactly 10 years ago as acting director of IRS, correct? Under
Correct.
the Obama administration?
Yes.
When you came in at that time, the IRS was facing a tremendous amount of criticism because it felt the number of people criticized that the IRS was targeting specific political groups for a tax-exempt status, correct?
That was the allegation, yes.
What did you find?
So through the process, and I was there for 8 months, we provided a tremendous amount of information to the authoritative committees and the Inspector General, and I would really rely on the final reports of TIGTA and the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation that thoroughly, over many years, evaluated those issues. And we can
the
go over those
IRS
results, but
Yeah. So the IRS
your
knew
time.
10 years ago that it was already being criticized for going after Tea Party groups in their tax-exempt status.
that was the allegation.
So fast forward 10 years later, and I don't need to repeat the questions that we heard from Chairman Smith or from Congressman Temney, Congressman Stubbe, but it seems like the exact same thing is still happening in the IRS. I mean, nobody wants to pay their taxes. The IRS has a reputation as an agency that most people, most Americans feel, and it doesn't help that we've seen in this history that the IRS seems to be treating Americans different based on either their political affiliations or their family affiliations. So, Mr. Werfel, without getting into details of those past cases, how can you assure the U.S. public moving forward that they can actually trust the IRS to treat everyone the same regardless of political views?
Here's my assurances. It is my firm commitment that there is absolutely no place for political bias at the IRS. I will take very seriously any evidence of political bias and will immediately refer it to the Inspector General. We have
So including the examples that
any
that
example,
Congressman, okay.
anytime.
Okay, I appreciate that.
I will always refer to the Inspector General.
All right.
And also, I
I'm
will
going
work
to reclaim my
tirelessly to
time because
implement
I want to make sure that I'm staying on time. I'd like to discuss the IRS plan of how your agency intends to spend the $80 billion passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. I have voted to repeal this now twice, but as of now, this money will still be available to the IRS. I'm concerned with a number of provisions in this plan, including the $45.6 billion for auditing and enforcement compared to only $3.2 billion for taxpayer services, which results in $14 spent on enforcement for every $1 spent on taxpayer services. Now, you have said that, we're hiring more people to answer the phones.
We are.
And yet you're spending 14 times the amount on enforcement and a very small amount on customer service. And of the dollars that you're spending on customer service, over 30% of that is being used to implement IRA green energy provisions.
Yeah. So I'm not really sure I know your question, but I can comment on it.
Are you spending 14 times as much on enforcement as you are on customer service?
We are spending consistent with the appropriation amounts
But
that
that happens to be
Congress
14
enacted
times as much on enforcement as on customer service, even though the complaints that we have had have to do with our constituents not even getting their refunds on time.
My commitment, Congresswoman, is to spend those funds as effectively as we can with good program integrity and in the best interests of the taxpayer.
But we're still spending 14 times as much on enforcement with the promise that we're not increasing the percentages at all of audits.
We're not increasing the percentage
we're
of
gonna be
audits
spending
for people
14
earning
times as much.
$400,000 or less. We are increasing the percentage of audits for those wealthy taxpayers where we also have historically low audit rates. So the enforcement funds that you're describing are critically important in terms of ensuring that Americans at every income level know that the IRS is treating every income level
I just think it's
equally.
disingenuous for you to say that you're spending much more money for people answering phones when you're spending 14 times as much on enforcement.
Well, we hired 5,000 people this filing season to answer phones, and we are making improvements. It's in our plan issued April 6th on all the steps we're working to with the money that we have. But there is a
It's
challenge.
good to know that you can do that in $2 billion. You can hire 5,000 people on that. If that's the case, then I'm thrilled to hear that.
Well, we
because the
need
numbers
more
that
than
I'm
just
hearing is not
people.
what you're-
We need more than just people. I mean, one of the challenges, and I don't want to take up too much.
Well, I appreciate that, and I've got 7 more minutes. I've got one quick question. Of the IRS agents the IRS people that are helping on customer service, do you have 100% of your workforce back to work 5 days a week?
Everyone's working.
Do you have your workforce back to work in the office 5 days a week?
Well, not everyone is in the office, but everyone's working. And one thing about
What percentage of your workforce is back in the office?
I don't have the exact figure on that.
I yield
can
back.
get
Thank
that
you.
for you.
Gentleman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Neal. Thank you, Chairman Werfel, for being here. You've got a very tough job.
You do.
Very challenging. Obviously, we talked a lot about the $80 billion of funding in the IRS. I want to just note that, but that's not where I'm going. $4.8 billion was for business modernization systems, about 6% of the funding. The key here is that in February, the GAO has published a report outlining the status of IRS, its IT modernization, which is concerning to me. A third of the applications and nearly a fourth of the software is considered legacy. They're way behind. The assets range from 25 to 64 years of age, including software that needs up to 15 versions, or 15 versions of new versions. It also noted that the individual master file has been in place since 1970 and barely has anybody that understands the code, or I mean, it's stressed. So my question is, it seems like we're cutting down a tree with a dull axe. And could we be more efficient? Well, let me back up. Is the $4.8 billion, will that satisfy creating a whole new system that is required or needed?
I would need to line up those funds, but to make sure that I'm answering your question, we have a larger fund of money available in the Inflation Reduction Act to improve our overall operation support, which includes technology. But the bottom line is we do need to update our core systems.
That's what I'm asking you. So is the 4.8 billion enough to update your core systems? That's simply what I'm asking.
I'd have to get back to you in terms of making sure that I'm lining up that 4.8 billion, but there's multiple core systems. There's the individual master file, there's the business master file, there's our enterprise case management system.
Chairman Werfel, do you see this as a concern when you have such an archaic system? I mean, I can't even imagine a banking industry or any business running on such a system. I mean, some of this is DOS, I think.
Yes.
I mean, this is crazy. I mean, think about that, running on DOS.
Yeah.
I don't mean to stump you, but.
No. I mean, you're preaching to the choir here in terms of the need to update these systems. They are on old COBOL-based language.
Yeah.
Those need to be updated.
Great. I'd love to see the colleges and universities that still teach Cobalt. I mean, but so this is my concern, right? So what has happened in the last year under the administration, right, is we're going down the path of OECD with Pillar 2. We have Guilty right now that has 16 data points that's being collected. If you go down Pillar 2, you're going to probably have 200 data points that needs to be collected. We're also going with a 15% minimum tax, book tax. I mean, these are very complex things, and yet, would it be fair to say that we don't have a system to handle all this?
Like right now, the systems are functioning. They need to function into the future better. And so what I mean by that is not enough processes are automated. We have updates we need to do to our data security requirements for these systems. And we can't hire as agilely as we could because people don't know COBOL.
Thank you. You just answered my question. That's exactly right. Here's my thing. Wouldn't you want to dramatically update your system first before you're updating all your workforce? I mean, right now, like I said, you have to hire somebody that knows COBOL or DOS, heaven forbid. You know, you hear what I'm saying? I mean, how does it, can you square this up?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to do multiple things to serve taxpayers in different ways. Like, if I stop and just focus on the technology, then I'm not putting the people in the taxpayer assistance centers, and people come to shuttered taxpayer assistance centers. If I don't hire people to process the employee retention credit, then people are waiting longer. So we have to have the ability to manage multiple priorities simultaneously.
Sure, there's a lot of things, but this is what happens with such a complex tax code. And I mean, I want everybody to know out there that, I mean, DOS, Cobalt, this is when a system's probably 25 years or 60, up to 25 to 45 years of age. The security concerns alone scare me. Just in great fear of what, you know, what data is you're collecting and what could be out in the public if we don't get this right. So I humbly ask, we got to make sure that we get a system that's updated, that can handle these complex income returns, because it's critical to our service.
It's actually a mission critical system, and it needs to be updated.
Thank you. Thanks, and I yield back.
Mr. Evans is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to congratulate you first for the job and all the things that you're trying to do. I have two questions. First question is, Congressman Moore and I recently introduced legislation to expand poverty-busting earned income tax. I want to follow with this question. What is the IRS doing to help low-income families who might not file the tax returns navigate through the tax system and access to benefits they have earned? That's one question. Second question, how does the agency plan to deploy Inflation Reduction Act funds to improve customer service and provide timely response to our constituents?
Yep. So I appreciate both questions. On the first one, we absolutely have an opportunity to up our game in terms of how we engage the public around what benefits and what credits they're eligible for. We try to go out using press releases, social media, to remind people of what they might be eligible for. We tell them they may be eligible for a credit they should file. We've started to take other steps. We have EITC Awareness Day that we participate in. We have taxpayer experience days at our walk-in centers on Saturdays, where we try to work with local organizers to make sure people understand what might be available to them, and then how they should go about working with volunteers like VITA, which is one of our big partners, in helping them apply and fill out their taxes with the credit in mind. That's a healthy amount of activity, but it's not nearly enough, because I think there is not enough people eligible for these credits that are actually applying for these credits. And I think there's an opportunity to up that. In terms of the operating plan, and there's a bunch of different things that we're trying to do to improve service, speed, accessibility. So it's one thing, we have to staff all of these centers correctly. The calls, if you want to walk in, we should be staffed. If you want to call us, there should be someone waiting for that call. If you want to go on irs.gov, we should be able to be modern and, for example, have an individual account for you so that you can immediately go on, not get on the phone with someone to see the status of your account, but actually log in with your username and password and see, here's the status of my account. Oh, look, there's a flag. Let me go see if I can resolve it. And resolving it in real time, and essentially end the era of letters back and forth and correspondence with the IRS in paper. All of that will be made possible by the Inflation Reduction Act. If we don't have those funds, then we're just reverting back to just answering phones. And so that's why I keep emphasizing it's important to fund our modernization, because at the end of the day, who benefits? Taxpayers.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. We greatly appreciate it. Mr. Carey.
Commissioner, thank you for being with us. I know it's been a long day. I'm going to go through a few things. I'm a huge believer in affordable housing, but as well as conversion as it relates to many of the office buildings that we have in our inner cities, which I represent. But what I'm going to focus on is historical tax credits. So I don't think anybody else has done that yet. So I just want to get your mindset as I read through some of the examples that I have back in Ohio. In January of 2021, 9 of my colleagues in Congress, including Ohio Senator Brown and Portman, sent a letter to the former commissioner about the IRS denying historic preservation easement tax deductions because an Ohio building owner installed an ADA-compliant wheelchair ramp on a historic structure. This building owner, who is a taxpayer, had worked with the National Park Service to design the ramp in a way that would protect the historic character of the building. But the IRS said the law does not provide exemptions for local fire and safety laws for Americans with Disability Act when considering whether an easement compliance with this structure is this statutory requirement. The IRS subsequently reversed course, and the IRS Office of Chief Counsel released a memorandum in March of 21 that clarified that the installation of an ADA accessibility ramp was permitted. So they did that. However, I was recently made aware that the IRS has again begun to deny easement deductions on historic buildings, this time over the hypothetical scenario that a building owner might sometime in the future install a wheelchair ramp. The IRS enforcement officer recently denied a historic preservation easement saying, and I quote, "In the event the use changed to a retirement home for the elderly, it would be likely required many modifications such as wheelchair ramps, additional elevators, removal of expansion of current street level doors and windows in order to comply with the codes of a retirement community. A change in use would likely require changes on all sides of the building and would be inconsistent with the use of the building." Now, we all believe in historic preservation. I don't think there's any one of us. So my question is, do you agree with the IRS Office of Chief Counsel memo stating that the ADA accessibility ramp should be permitted?
I haven't read that, but yes, if there's an IRS counsel legitimate opinion out there, then I would support it.
So should taxpayers, historic building owners, something that's very important in the state of Ohio but across the country, and historic preservation community be forced to choose between complying with the ADA or to using congressionally authorized preservation programs like the historic preservation easement?
As you've presented it, Congressman, it seems like there's it's very incongruent and not clear what the IRS is asking of in relation to the Americans with Disability Act enhancements. Without commenting on any specific taxpayer, I want to get back to you with some clarity on the overarching policy.
And this is an issue that I feel very strongly about, because as we've seen in many of our cities, the ability to go in and take over some of these structures, many of them were eyesores for many, many years. So I would appreciate if your team would get back to me, because it is something that I feel very strongly about, and I appreciate your time. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Schneider is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Werfel. Thank you for your patience today. It's been a long day. Save the best for the last. But also congratulations on your recent appointment. Right, and you're the last. That's the best. But I'm excited about working together. I want to echo what my colleague from Illinois, Mr. Davis, said, and praise the great people in the Chicago office for their efforts. And I commend the incredible progress the IRS has made in general improving customer service over the past year, largely thanks to the funding we secured through the Inflation Reduction Act. A couple of things. I know COBOL. I've done programming on tax software, but in 1984. But I also worked at Sears Catalog overseeing their call center. I know how hard it is.
We are hiring at the IRS.
Yes. So we'll talk afterwards. But my team can attest to the quicker turnaround times and the better service of the IRS now available because of these funds. And I've heard the same from our constituents as well as my friends in the accounting profession. I do want to mention some outstanding constituent cases. My office has been working with people who have not yet received their 2021 or 22 tax refunds, either due to identity theft or delays in the processing and verification of their identity, or backlog of paper tax returns. We've been in touch with companies waiting for their employee retention tax credit. Yes. It's compounded by the financial strain experienced due to the pandemic. It's been a burden on these companies. So I'll forward everything to your office, but can I ask for your help, your commitment to work together? Thank you very, very much. I appreciate that. Let me go back to the tax gap for a second. You earlier said it's about $500 billion a year.
That's correct.
Is that correct? $5 trillion over the next decade?
That's correct.
What are roughly the projected receipts coming in for fiscal year 23?
I think it's around 4.6 trillion.
So we're talking about a year's worth of receipts over the course of the year that then puts the burden on the law binding. Very roughly, I won't hold this to this, but what percent of that tax gap do you think is in those 300 and some odd thousand tax returns? Well, those people are filing returns, but that top 1% who
Here's the challenge, Congressman, is that we have to evolve the way we measure the tax gap because of how quickly that landscape is changing for our high-income filers. We can't measure effectively what we can't see. And the reality is because we've been under-resourced and haven't had the capacity to assess these complicated returns, that's why you have previous commissioners, kind of opining on what that number might be.
But it's a big number.
I believe it's going to be a very big number, and I think CBO agrees with that, and that's why they see a lot of deficit savings in our plan to go and better assess.
And I just want to be sensitive to time. You said you have roughly 2,600 people to review the returns of this high.
390,000 of our highest wealth filers.
Yeah. How big do you think the army of tax experts, the tax accountants, tax lawyers, helping that 390,000 filers might be? Bigger than 2,600?
I don't know. It's big, and it's their right to do it. But I also feel like for middle and low-income Americans to feel confident that the tax system is fair, we have to be ready for those types of reviews and to be able to assess them effectively.
And let me be clear, they should have that advice. They should be doing everything they can to not pay one penny more of the taxes they owe. But
it's their fiduciary responsibility to do so.
Right. There's an asymmetry that we should be able to make sure that they're paying every penny their own.
Exactly.
Thank you. Let me go back now to the service levels beyond the anecdotes we're hearing from our caseworkers and my constituents. The IRS filing season 2023 report card notes that the IRS has exceeded even its own metrics for new hiring of personnel and customer service roles. This includes nearly 6,000 customer service reps onboarded, nearly 3,000 employees in submission process being hired. I ask unanimous consent that the IRS filing season 2023 report card be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Commissioner, my colleague earlier showed some charts asserting that the IRS priorities when it came to customer service were upside down. Made it look like the agency didn't care about taxpayer service, but that's not really true. Even amid the anemic funding over the past years, working with systems on COBOL and DOS, and maybe even Fortran, didn't the IRS always do its best to shift resources to try to handle all customer service needs?
I mean, it's absolutely a priority, customer service. I mean, if we're not answering the phones, if we're not helping taxpayers meet their obligations, then the system isn't working effectively. And the reality is we have to be able to do both effectively. And I think we can, and we have historically. I think the reality is because of 15 years of underfunding and then the impacts of the pandemic, we found ourselves in a really unhealthy state, and Americans suffered for it by not being able to get help from the IRS and meeting their tax obligation. Both are a priority, enforcement and service. But if you're a small business, middle or low income, what the Inflation Reduction Act means for you is better service. It doesn't mean a new increase in our enforcement capacity. That is only for our highest wealth taxpayers.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Panetta is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Werfel, thanks for being here today, and thank you for your testimony. You've done a really good job, and I do hope, first of all, it gives me confidence in your ability to lead the IRS, but I hope it gives your employees confidence as well. So I appreciate that. Especially at this time when you're taking on this role following these historic investments that we've made in the IRS. And with that investment, as you mentioned previously, you're able to hire 5,000 more employees, allowing the IRS to answer 2.4 million calls than last year. That's great, but I think, as you know, it's just not good enough. But I have confidence that you're going to get to good. I really
I'm not
do.
satisfied.
I get it. Good, and I appreciate that. Thank you for saying that. I think you're going to because, what, you got some new callback options and you got new scanning technology as well, which I think will help. In addition to these customer improvements, you've added funding for the staff to reduce our tax gap and our deficits in the long run as well. Now, despite the majority's bill yesterday, I firmly believe that we have to protect this investment and ensure that we continue funding the IRS to serve customers and administer the tax code fairly, and also so that we can go after those tax cheats, those people who are intentionally evading the taxes that they owe. So once again, thank you for your service. Now, this is great. I got a question here that being the last in line on this dais, it's kind of nice that no one's talked about this. But I'm also proud of this question because this is a question from a constituent that was brought to my attention based on the good work of my staffer, Mark Denon, who basically talked about these ERTC mills. Basically, exactly. In my area in Central Coast of California, you listen to the radio and you're just bombarded by these advertisements for small businesses to apply for employee retention tax credits. Yet these advertisements, they're directly targeting businesses who did not experience any pandemic losses and are most likely ineligible for the ERTC. Now, I'm concerned that some of these companies may be taking an overly generous view of the ERTC, taking fees or cuts of refunds, but disappearing if small businesses get audited if they are not, in fact, eligible. So obviously, you put out a warning, and I'm grateful for that, to small businesses in October about these ERTC mills, but it's clear more needs to be done. So I got two questions. What else is the IRS planning to do to protect small businesses from these ERTC mills? And are there actions that we in Congress can do to shut these things down?
Yeah. So thank you for the question. And I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges we have with ERC processing, and there's a couple different reasons why there's a backlog. One of them is that we do get a lot of fraudulent or ineligible applications in that clog the system. And so we're working to try to figure out how to ferret those out as effectively as we can. I think the first thing is, as you said, we have to be communicative. Like we have what we call our dirty dozen scams. We go out, we try to explain to as many people that will hear us and engage with us. These are the things to be on the lookout for, that this might not end well for you because the person doesn't have your best interest, or this is not an advisable way of getting tax advice. So we can do more of that. There are steps often that Congress can do to give us authorities to regulate. I would love to work with you on what those steps may be. Ultimately, it would be up to the Secretary of the Treasury in terms of whether we would support them, but I can certainly answer questions around the types of tools that would help us.
Good. Look forward to working with you.
Thank
It's been
you.
a long day for you, for us. That's why I'm going to yield back my minute. Thank you,
Great.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Werfel. We appreciate you appearing before our committee today. We appreciate that you were here for over 4 hours. Definitely appreciate your time and your comments. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the committee stands adjourned.